The Alchemist of Anarchy. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Counter. It was a silence of 3 parts. The first was the silence of the city outside. Cenote, the great sinkhole. Even at night the city usually groaned, the shifting of rusty pipes, the coughing of the miners, the distant weeping of the steam vents. But tonight, the rain was heavy. A thick, oily curtain that drowned the world in a rhythmic drumming, muffling the screams of the machinery. The second silence was inside the tavern, the broken vial. It was small, smelling of pine resin and old regret. The few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, careful not to make a sound, careful not to attract attention. In the gut, attention is a currency that buys you nothing but a shallow grave. The third silence was the man behind the bar. He was wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better centuries. He moved with the economy of someone who had done this 1,000,000 times, or perhaps someone who was saving his energy for a fight. His hair was gray, thinning, but his eyes were startlingly green, too bright, too alive for a man burying himself in the dark. My name is Kalen. I am a scribe for the new council, and I had been hunting this silence for 2 years. I walked to the bar. The floorboards didn't creak. I had paid good money for boots that didn't betray me. They say the ale is watered down, I said, placing a heavy iron coin on the counter. But they say the owner knows how to mix a drink that makes you forget your own name. The man didn't look up. He kept polishing the glass. Circular motions. Hypnotic. "We serve ale," he said. His voice was like dry leaves scraping over stone, melodic but brittle. "If you want to forget, go to the opium dens in Sector 4. If you want a drink, sit down." "I don't want to forget," I pressed, lowering my voice. "I want to remember. I want to know about the night of the purple fog. I want to know about the jester who killed the matriarch." The man stopped polishing. The silence in the room sharpened. It felt like a wire tightening around my throat. He looked up, and for a second I saw it. Not the tired innkeeper, but the spark, the madness, the genius. "You are looking for a story," he said softly. "People love stories. They like their monsters to have horns, and their heroes to have shining swords. They like clear lines. I am looking for the truth, Van." He winced at the name, a small, almost imperceptible twitch of his left eye. He set the glass down. "Truth," he chuckled. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of something breaking deep underground. "Truth is a volatile element, scribe. Handle it poorly and it burns the skin off your bones." He reached under the counter. I tensed, my hand drifting to the knife in my belt. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a bottle. No label. The liquid inside was violet, swirling with a pearlescent heavy dust. He poured 2 glasses. "You want to know how a street rat became the most feared man in Cenote?" Van asked, sliding a glass toward me. "You want to know why they call me the jester? Why they say I laughed while the city burned?" "Yes." "Then you are asking the wrong questions." He took a sip. His eyes drifted to the window, to the rain-streaked glass, as if seeing a ghost in the reflection. "I was never a villain, scribe, and I was certainly no hero. I was a performer. The world was a stage built on a foundation of lies, and I was the only one brave enough, or mad enough, to deliver the punchline." He leaned forward. The candlelight caught the scars on his hands. Chemical burns, old and white. "If we do this, we do it my way. No interruptions, no moralizing. You write it down exactly as I say it. Because when I am done, you will understand that the Joker you fear was the only sane man in an insane world." I picked up my quill. My hand was shaking. "Where do we begin?" Van smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss and found it funny. "We begin," he said, "with the mud and the smell of lavender." 2. The Boy with the Chemist's Hands. I was born in the sump. That is the polite name. We called it the drain. It is the absolute bottom of Cenote, where the sunlight is just a myth told by grandmothers to make children cry. In the sump, you have two choices. You can dig for coal, or you can dig for scraps. I did neither. I watched. I was small for my age, fragile. My bones felt like bird hollows. But I had something the other boys didn't. I had steady hands, and I had a mind that saw connections where others saw chaos. I didn't see a pile of rotting garbage. I saw saltpeter. I saw sulfur. I saw potential energy waiting to be released. My father was a miner, a massive man, carved from the rock he broke every day. He believed in the system. He believed that if he worked hard enough, the matriarch in the high throat would reward him. He believed in the order. "Keep your head down, Van," he would tell me, scrubbing the coal dust from his pores with cold water. "The nail that sticks out gets hammered." But I couldn't keep my head down. I was too busy looking up at the lights of the throat, miles above us. I found my first teacher in the ruins of an old apothecary shop that had fallen from the upper levels during a tremor. His name was useless, for he was dead when I found him, crushed under a beam. But his books survived. I couldn't read the high tongue, but I could read diagrams. I could read the language of the universe. Catalyst, reagent, reaction. I spent my nights mixing. I learned that the moss growing in the ventilation shafts, when dried and mixed with rust, created a powder that burned with a blinding white light. I learned that the venom of the sewer rats could be distilled into a paralytic agent. I was 12 years old when I performed my first trick. The tax collectors had come. They wore masks of polished iron, faceless and cruel. They wanted my father's weekly earnings, all of it. They said he hadn't met his quota. My father begged. He fell to his knees in the mud, a man of iron, reduced to a weeping child by the system he worshipped. I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't anger. Anger is hot. This was cold. It was clarity. I climbed to the rafters of our shack. I had a small pouch of my powder, the flash moss. "Gentlemen," I shouted. My voice was high, squeaking with fear, but I forced it to be loud. The collectors looked up. My father looked up. "Watch closely." I threw the pouch into the open brazier fire. Snap. The explosion wasn't big, but the light was absolute. For a terrifying second, the dark shack was brighter than the sun. The collectors screamed, blinded, stumbling back into the mud. In the confusion, I didn't run. I laughed. It bubbled out of me, uncontrollable. It wasn't funny, it was tragic. But that was the secret, you see. That was the lesson the city taught me that day. The difference between a tragedy and a comedy is just lighting. That was the day Van the boy died, and the jester began to paint his face. 3. The architecture of a smile. The rain outside the broken vial had changed. It was no longer a drum. It was a hiss. Van poured himself another glass of the violet wine. He held it up to the candlelight, staring through the liquid as if it were a lens into the past. "You think the makeup was a disguise?" Van said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. "Wasn't it?" I asked, my quill hovering over the parchment. White face, red smile. "To hide your identity?" Van laughed softly. "No, scribe. A disguise is when you want to blend in. A disguise is for cowards. I wore a costume. When you wear a costume, people stop looking at you. They look at the performance. And while they are watching the juggler's hands, they don't notice the knife sliding between their ribs." He took a drink. "I didn't learn that in a book. I learned it in the gizzard." The gizzard was the middle district of Cenote, too poor for the sun, too rich for the mud. It was where the factories were. And where there are factories, there are tired men. And where there are tired men, there is a need for distraction. I was 16. I had fled the sump after the fire in the shack. I was starving, angry, and brilliant. I found work with the troupe of the hanged, a traveling circus of thieves, whoremongers, and actors. They didn't care about my chemistry. They cared that I was small and quick. "Smile, boy," the ringmaster would scream at me. He was a fat man who smelled of sour milk. "The crowd doesn't pay to see your hunger. They pay to see your joy." But I couldn't smile. Not really. My face was set in a permanent scowl of survival. So, I used my chemistry. I couldn't force my muscles to smile, so I painted one on. I mixed zinc oxide with lard for the white base. It covered the soot of the mines. I crushed cochineal beetles for the red, a blood-colored paste that didn't run when I sweated. I painted a smile that stretched from ear to ear, a smile that never faltered, a smile that mocked everything it saw. And a strange thing happened. When I wore the face, I wasn't Van the Rat anymore. I was free. I could insult a factory foreman, and he would laugh because I was a clown. I could steal an apple from a merchant's cart, and he would applaud my dexterity. The paint gave me immunity. I realized then the great flaw of the high society. They do not fear the fool. They think the fool is beneath them, and that is why the fool is the only one who can get close enough to cut the king's throat. I spent 3 years in the gizzard. I learned to tumble. I learned to throw knives. But mostly, I learned to read people. I learned that a man who laughs is a man with his guard down. And I began to crave a bigger stage. The gizzard was just a rehearsal. I looked up at the throat, the ring of light at the top of the world, and I knew. 4. The Wolf in Silk. "How does a clown enter the court of the matriarch?" I asked Van. The candle was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the tavern walls. "He doesn't walk in through the front door," Van replied. "He is invited. But first, he must become something exotic." I reinvented myself. I wasn't a street performer anymore. I was Van of the Deep, an eccentric artist from the uncharted depths of the sinkhole. I used my alchemy to create wonders. I made fireworks that bloomed into shapes of dragons without making a sound. I distilled perfumes that smelled like memories, fresh bread, rain on hot stone, a mother's embrace. Word traveled up. Gravity pulls things down, scribe, but curiosity climbs. The invitation came on paper that felt like skin. The gala of the eclipse, hosted by matriarch Vespera herself. The lift ride to the throat took an hour. As I ascended, the air changed. The smell of rust faded, replaced by the scent of jasmine and roasted meats. The pressure in my ears popped. When the doors opened, I almost blinded myself. The throat was white. White marble, white stone. It was clean, sterile. It was a hospital for the soul dead. I walked into the ballroom wearing a suit of purple velvet, my face painted in my signature white and red. I was the only splash of color in a sea of gold and white. Matriarch Vespera sat on a throne of glass. She was beautiful, in the way a glacier is beautiful. Cold, sharp, ancient. "Entertain us," she commanded. She didn't look at me. She looked through me. I didn't juggle. I didn't tumble. I walked to the center of the room. I pulled a single glass vial from my sleeve. "My lady," I said, my voice projecting perfectly to the back of the hall. "I do not bring tricks. I bring perspective." I poured a single drop of the liquid onto the pristine white floor. It hissed. It bubbled. And then it grew. A fast-growing crystalline fungus, vibrant blue, rising like a twisted tree in seconds. It bloomed, releasing a cloud of glittering spores. The crowd gasped. They clapped. They thought it was magic. But I was watching Vespera. She leaned forward. For the first time, her eyes focused on me. She saw the power in the chemistry. She didn't see art. She saw a weapon. "You are talented," she said, signaling for me to approach. I walked up the steps to the throne. The guards tensed, but she waved them off. I was just a fool, after all. "What do you call yourself?" she asked. I bowed low, so she couldn't see the hate burning in my eyes. "I am just a jester, my lady, here to remind you that even in the dark, things can grow." She hired me on the spot. I was to be her personal alchemist, her pet. I had infiltrated the heart of the beast. I was sleeping in the palace of the woman who starved my people. But the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the girl. Her name was Ilara. Not the street urchin I would meet later, no. This was the first Ilara, the daughter of the captain of the guard. She was the only person in the throat who didn't look at me like a tool. She looked at me like a man. And that was not part of the plan. I sat in my new laboratory, surrounded by silk and gold, and I realized with a terrifying clarity, to destroy this city, I would have to burn it all. And Ilara was standing right in the middle of the fire. 5. The chemistry of whisper and glass. The mask is not just paint, scribe. It is a parasite. You wear it long enough, and it begins to eat into the skin. It demands to be fed. At first, I wore the smile to hide my anger. But in the throat, amidst the silk and the perfume, I found myself wearing it to hide my heart. Because I was falling in love. And that was the one chemical reaction I had not calculated. Ilara was not like the others. Her father, Captain Kale, was a man of duty, a statue of iron. But Ilara was water. She moved through the rigid social structures of the court with a grace that made the nobles look clumsy. We met often in the high gardens, a glass dome suspending a forest of imported trees over the abyss. "You don't laugh like a fool," she said one evening. We were standing by the railing, looking down into the swirling darkness of the sinkhole below. The city lights of the gut were just distant, dying embers. I adjusted my velvet collar. "A fool laughs at everything, my lady. A jester laughs only at the truth." "Then tell me a truth, Van," she said. She stepped closer, the scent of rain and jasmine. She reached out, her hand hovering near my painted cheek. "Tell me something real." I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to push her away, to protect the mission. If she knew I was a rat from the sump, she would be disgusted. If she knew what I was planning, she would be horrified. So I lied, but I made the lie beautiful. "The truth," I said, catching her hand, "is that the only thing brighter than the sun above us is the courage it takes to look down." She smiled, a real smile. It cracked my defenses wide open. But the moment was shattered by a bell, the summoning bell. Matriarch Vespera required her pet. I left Ilara in the garden and descended into the archives beneath the palace. My access as the court alchemist gave me keys to rooms no one else entered. I wasn't there to mix potions. I was there to find the recipe. I found the ledger in a dusty cabinet marked Infrastructure. I opened it, expecting to find tax records. Instead, I found a diagram of the city's water table. I traced the lines with a trembling finger. The water didn't just come from the aquifers. It passed through a secondary chamber, a mixing chamber. And there, written in Vespera's own elegant, sharp handwriting, was the chemical formula. Silver dust extract. Dosage, 0.04%. Purpose, sedation and compliance. I stared at the page. The air left my lungs. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just greed. It was farming. They were drugging the water supply of the gut. They were keeping 50,000 people in a chemical haze, dulling their rage, dulling their ambition, keeping them docile enough to work but too tired to revolt. I closed the book. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I thought of Ilara. She drank the filtered water of the throat. She was clear-headed. She was free. I thought of my father, dying in the mud, too tired to fight back. I realized then that I couldn't just kill Vespera. Killing her wouldn't stop the pumps. Killing her wouldn't wake the city up. I needed a shock. I needed to turn the antidote into a weapon. I needed to make the whole world go mad, just for a moment, so they could finally see how sane they actually were. 6. The Dinner of Wolves. "You look pale, Van," Vespera said. We were at dinner. A long table of black obsidian. Vespera sat at the head, picking at a plate of roasted songbird. Her counselors, men of grease and gold, sat around her like vultures. I stood by her side, the loyal dog. The paint on my face felt tight. "Just the vapors, my lady," I replied, bowing. "A new concoction, it lingers." "Good," she purred, "because tonight we celebrate." She raised her glass. The crystal chimed. "To the Festival of Ascension," she announced. "In 3 days, we open the gates. We let the rabble look up at us and weep with gratitude." 3 days. My timeline had just collapsed. I had planned for a month. Now I had 72 hours. But first, Vespera's eyes slid to me, cold and reptilian. "A test. Captain Kale?" The doors opened. Ilara's father walked in. He looked grim. Behind him, 2 guards dragged a man. He was a miner. His skin was gray with coal dust. He was bleeding. I recognized him. Jonas. We had stolen bread together when we were 10. "This filth," Vespera said, gesturing with a fork, "was caught trying to sabotage a lift. He claims he is part of a movement." She turned to me. "Make him speak, Jester. Use your potions. Show us what truth looks like." The room went silent. This was the trap. If I refused, I exposed myself. If I did it, I became the monster I was fighting. I walked over to Jonas. He looked up at me. He saw the white paint, the red smile. He didn't recognize Van. He only saw a demon of the court. "Please," Jonas whispered. I reached into my satchel. My hand brushed against a vial of acid. It would burn his tongue out. It would satisfy Vespera. I looked at Captain Kale. His hand was on his sword hilt, his knuckles white. He hated this. He hated her. But he did nothing. Because of duty. Because of Ilara. I pulled out a different vial, blue liquid, sleep shade. "Open wide," I whispered to Jonas, winking my left eye, a signal from the streets. "Play along." I poured the liquid. Jonas gagged, then slumped forward, feigning unconsciousness. "He is weak, my lady," I announced, turning to Vespera with a theatrical flourish. His mind collapsed before the truth could escape. A pity. The poor in spirit. They break so easily. Vespera stared at me. For a second, I thought she saw the lie. Then, she laughed. A cruel, high sound. "Useless trash. Throw him out the airlock." "Wait!" The voice came from the doorway. It was Ilara. She stood there, horrified. She looked at the beaten man. She looked at her father, doing nothing. And then she looked at me. "Van?" she whispered. She didn't see the jester. She saw the man she had held hands with in the garden. And she saw me standing over a body, holding a vial. The look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was disappointment. It was heartbreak. Vespera turned to Ilara. "Daughter of the captain, you should not be here. This is men's work." "He is a monster," Ilara said, pointing at me. Her voice shook. "He is my monster," Vespera corrected. I stood there, paralyzed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell Ilara that I had saved Jonas, that I was trying to save them all. But I couldn't. The mask had to stay on. I bowed to Ilara. a deep, mocking bow. "Everyone is a monster, my lady," I said, my voice dripping with a fake, manic glee. "Some of us are just honest about it." Ilara turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed down the marble hall. As she left, something in me snapped. The last tether to humanity, the last hesitation. Vespera wanted a show? She wanted the truth? I looked at the matriarch, sipping her wine, oblivious to the fact that she was sitting next to a bomb. 3 days, I thought. I would not just break the city. I would shatter it into 1,000,000 pieces. And I would start with the ventilation system. I turned to Vespera and widened my painted smile until it hurt. "My lady," I said, "for the festival, I have an idea for a grand finale." 7. The breath of the city. In the tavern, Van swirled the last of the purple wine in his glass. "Do you know how a city breathes, scribe?" he asked. I shook my head. "It breathes through the throat. It inhales the clean, cold air from the surface, filters it through the great fans, and pushes it down into the gut. It is a circulation system. And like any body, if you introduce a poison into the lungs, it reaches the heart in seconds." The festival of ascension had begun. I could hear the music thumping through the walls of the maintenance shaft. It sounded like a headache. I was 300 feet up, wedged inside the primary intake vent. The heat was unbearable. The massive brass fans spun below me, blades the size of guillotines slicing the air with a rhythmic whoosh, thud, whoosh, thud. I wasn't wearing my velvet suit. I was stripped to the waist, covered in grease, my face paint smeared by sweat. The jester was gone. The alchemist remained. Strapped to my chest was the canister. It wasn't a bomb. It was a pressurized tank containing 3 gallons of Veritas gas, distilled from the psychotropic fungi of the deep sumps, refined with accelerants. I had calculated the dispersal rate. Once released into the intake, the fans would atomize the liquid. Within 2 minutes, it would fill the plaza of the throat. Within 10, it would drift down to the gut. I checked the valve. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. "Van?" The voice came from the service hatch below me. I looked down. Ilara. She had followed me. She was wearing a gala dress, torn at the hem, stained with grease from the climb. She looked out of place, a flower in a furnace. "Get down, Ilara!" I shouted over the roar of the fans. "Stop!" she screamed, climbing higher. "I know what you're doing. I saw the diagrams in your room. You're going to poison them." "I'm going to cure them," I yelled back. I locked my legs around the pipe and reached for the valve. "My father is down there," she cried, tears cutting through the grime on her face. "Innocent people are down there." "There are no innocent people in Cenote, Ilara. Only the guilty and the asleep." I looked at her. Really looked at her. I loved her. That was the tragedy. I loved her enough to want a better world for her, even if she hated me for building it. "Please," she begged, reaching out a hand. "Come down. We can find another way." I hesitated. For one heartbeat, the boy from the sump wanted to take her hand, wanted to climb down, wash off the paint, and live a quiet life. But then I heard the voice from the speakers above. Matriarch Vespera. "My children, we give you this air as a gift." The lie. The absolute, suffocating weight of the lie. It crushed the hope in my chest. "I'm sorry, Ilara." I didn't take her hand. I turned to the canister. "Don't!" she screamed. I spun the wheel. Hiss! The seal broke. A jet of violet gas shot into the fan blades. The massive steel wings caught the chemical, chopped it, and hurled it out into the world. The purple fog descended. 7. The punchline. I scrambled up the ladder to the observation grate. I had to see it. The plaza of the throat was a sea of white and gold. Thousands of nobles stood facing the balcony where Vespera stood. The gas hit them like a physical wave. It wasn't a choking cloud. It was a mist, shimmering and sweet. Vespera was mid-sentence. "Our generosity is the foundation of—" She stopped. She blinked. The gas filled her lungs. It crossed the blood-brain barrier instantly, dissolving the carefully constructed walls of her ego. She gripped the golden railing. Her knuckles turned white. She tried to smile, but her face contorted into a snarl. "Generosity," she muttered. The microphones picked up every wet, trembling syllable. Then she screamed, "I hate the smell of you!" The crowd froze. The silence was deafening. Vespera clawed at her neck, ripping her pearl necklace. The beads scattered like hail. "You look like livestock," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I stand here and smile and I want to vomit. I tax you until you starve because it's fun, because I can." The gas was spreading. The nobles in the front row started to sway. A duchess fell to her knees, laughing hysterically. "I never loved my husband. I only wanted his title." A high priest tore off his robes. "The gods are dead. We killed them to build the banks." It was a domino effect of madness. The social contract evaporated. The polite veneer of civilization was stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly, beautiful animal beneath. I looked down at the vent. Ilara was gone. She had fled back down. I looked back at the plaza. The chaos was spreading to the edge. The guards, the gilded guard, were ripping off their masks. And then, the sound from the gut arrived. It came up from the deep, a low, vibrating roar. The gas had reached the lower levels. The sedation in the water was being overridden by the chemical fury in the air. The elevator alarms started blaring. They weren't coming down. They were coming up. I watched Vespera collapse on the balcony, weeping, confessing sins that would make a demon blush. It was grotesque. It was perfect. I leaned my forehead against the cold grate. I had won. The lie was dead. But as I looked at the purple haze swirling over the ruins of the society, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt hollow. I had turned on the lights, yes, but I had burned the house down to do it. The door to the maintenance roof burst open behind me. I turned. It wasn't guards. It was Captain Kale. He wasn't wearing his helmet. His eyes were red, dilated from the gas. He was weeping, tears streaming down his face, his sword dragging on the ground. "You," Kale choked out. He wasn't angry. He was broken. "You showed me everything. I set you free, Captain," I said, stepping onto the ledge. The wind whipped my hair. "Ilara," he sobbed. "She breathed it. She's screaming, Van. She's screaming everything she ever thought. She's screaming that she loved you, and she's screaming that she hopes you die." The words hit me harder than a blade. I stepped back, teetering over the abyss. The city below was a kaleidoscope of fire and noise. "Then she is finally honest," I said. My voice broke. I looked at Kale one last time. "Don't let them rebuild it the same way, Captain. Make something new." And then, before he could swing his sword, before the guilt could paralyze me, I let gravity take me. I didn't fall into the dark to die. I had one last trick. A glider chute stitched into the lining of my coat. But as I plummeted into the purple fog, listening to the city scream its truth, I knew that Van died on that roof. The man who landed in the shadows of the gut. He was just a ghost. A ghost with a painted smile that he could never quite wash off. Van placed the glass on the counter. It was empty. "That was 10 years ago," he whispered. "The council fell. The city is better, messier, louder, but honest." He looked at me, his green eyes dull. "And Ilara?" I asked. "What happened to her?" Van looked away. He picked up the rag and started polishing the counter again. circular motions. Some truths, he said softly, are too heavy to carry, even for her. He blew out the candle. The story is over, scribe. Get out, before I decide to tell you the real punchline. 9. Interlude. The silence of 3 parts. The candle on the bar had burned down to a stub, creating a pool of wax that looked like frozen milk. The tavern, the broken vial, was quiet. Outside, the rain of Cenote never really stopped. It just changed temper. Tonight, it was a weeping drizzle, slicking the cobblestones of the gut. I, Kalen, sat looking at the man who claimed to be a ghost. Van picked up a rag. He started wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. It was a nervous tic, or perhaps a meditation. His hands were rough, stained with the kind of chemicals that don't wash off with soap. "You stopped," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the empty room. "You fell into the fog. You said Van died." Van didn't look up. He did. The boy who thought he could save the world died. The man who landed, well, he just had to pay the rent. The door to the tavern creaked open. The wind blew in, carrying the smell of wet sulfur and ozone. 3 men walked in. They were not customers. They moved with the swagger of men who owned the cobblestones they walked on. They wore the armbands of the Iron Syndicate, the new power in Sector 4. The leader, a man with a nose that had been broken more than once, walked up to the bar. He slammed a heavy, rusted gauntlet onto the wood. "Collection day, old man," the thug grunted. Van didn't flinch. He didn't stop wiping the counter. The rhythm of his hand remained perfect, circular, calm. "We paid last week, Torin," Van said. "The agreement was once a month." "Inflation," Torin sneered. He leaned over the bar, invading Van's space. "The air pumps are expensive. The syndicate needs more." I tensed. I reached for the knife in my boot. I knew history, but I didn't know if this old alchemist could still fight. Van's eyes flicked to me, just a microsecond. "Stay down." "I have no coin tonight, Torin," Van said. Torin grabbed a bottle of the expensive violet wine from the shelf and smashed it on the floor. The glass shattered. The smell of elderberry filled the air. "Then we take it out in trade," Torin growled. He reached for another bottle. Van stopped wiping. He placed his hand on the counter. Flat. "Torin," Van said. His voice dropped an octave. It wasn't the voice of a bartender. It was the voice of the jester. "Do you know what happens when you mix elderberry wine with the cleaning solution I use for this wood?" Torin paused. "What?" "Cyanide gas," Van lied. Or maybe he didn't. "It's faint, but in a closed room, with the windows shut against the rain." Van tapped the wet rag on the counter. "You just smashed the bottle. The fumes are rising. Can you taste almonds, Torin?" The thug blinked. He sniffed the air. The power of suggestion is a terrible thing. Torin stepped back. He coughed, a psychosomatic reaction. "If you leave now," Van whispered, "the fresh air might save you. If you stay, well, at least you'll leave a clean corpse." Torin looked at his men. Fear is contagious. They turned and scrambled out the door, tripping over each other into the rain. The door slammed shut. Silence returned. Van picked up a dustpan and began sweeping up the glass. "Was it true?" I asked, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "The cyanide?" Van looked at me. The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. "Scribe," he said, dumping the glass into a bin. "I use lemon oil to clean the wood. It smells nice. But fear? Fear smells like almonds if you tell someone it does." He poured 2 fresh drinks. Now, where were we? 10. The hangover of revolution. I took the drink. My hands were trembling slightly. I had just seen a master at work. Not a fighter, but a conductor of human behavior. "We were at the fall," I said. "The night of the purple fog." Van nodded. He leaned against the back shelf, his face in shadow. "The fall was the easy part. Gravity does the work. It's the landing that breaks you." "The history books say the matriarch died of heart failure," I said. "They say the council disbanded peacefully." "History books," Van scoffed. "Fiction written by the survivors to make themselves feel civilized. Vespera didn't die of a heart failure. She died of shame. When the gas wore off, when the truth stopped screaming, she couldn't live with the silence. She walked off the balcony herself. And the city? The city woke up with a hangover," Van said. He stared into his drink. "You see, Scribe, I thought that if I destroyed the lie, the truth would set everyone free. I thought people were naturally good, and only the system made them bad." He took a long sip. "I was wrong. The gas stripped away the fear, yes, but it also stripped away the restraint. The gut didn't just rise up, it ate the throat. For 3 weeks there was no law, just vengeance. The mobs hunted down anyone with soft hands. They burned the libraries because they were owned by the rich. They smashed the water filters because they were built by the council." "It was chaos," I whispered. "No," Van corrected. "It was anarchy. Chaos has no pattern. Anarchy has a pattern. The strong eat the weak. The syndicate you just saw? They were the miners who used their pickaxes to carve out a new kingdom. I traded a tyrant in silk for 100 tyrants in leather." "And Alara?" I asked. The name hung in the air like smoke. Van went still. The playful glint in his eyes vanished completely. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You are pushing, Scribe." "I need to know," I insisted. "Because she didn't die. I know she didn't. The records show she disappeared." Van walked around the bar. He pulled up a stool and sat directly in front of me. Close. Uncomfortably close. "Alara breathed the gas," Van said quietly. "She told me she hated me. She told me she loved me. And when the fog lifted, she remembered every word." "Where is she now?" "She is in the sump," Van said. "The deepest part, where even the rats don't go." "Why?" "Because she believes I was right," Van said, and the sadness in his voice was a physical weight. "She believes that the surface is irredeemable. She gathered the broken ones, the ones who liked the gas, the ones who want to feel that pure, burning truth forever. She started a cult, Kalen, the children of the vapor." He looked at me, his eyes piercing. "And that is why you are really here, isn't it? You aren't a historian. You have ink stains on your fingers, but you have calluses on your sword hand. You are an agent of the new council." I froze. He saw everything. "Yes," I admitted. "The children of the vapor are planning something. They aren't just worshipping the gas anymore. They are trying to recreate it. But stronger, lethal." Van closed his eyes. He looked very old suddenly. "She wants to finish the joke," he whispered. "We need you, Van," I said. "We need the alchemist. We need the jester. You are the only one who knows the formula. You are the only one who can create the antidote." Van laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You want me to save the city from the woman I drove mad?" "I want you to save her," I said. Van stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The reflection showed a man who was tired of running. "The jester is dead, Scribe." "Then resurrect him," I challenged. "Because if you don't, the punchline this time won't be funny. It will be silence. Absolute silence." Van stared at the glass. He traced a smiley face in the condensation. Then, he wiped it away with a violent smear of his thumb. "Fine," he said, "but I'm going to need my old coat." 11. The relic in the rain. We stepped out of the tavern, and the city hit us like a wet hammer. The rain in Cenote is not like rain elsewhere. It gathers soot as it falls from the throat, miles above. By the time it reaches the gut, it is black and oily. It slicked my hair to my skull instantly. Van didn't seem to notice. He stood on the cobblestones, looking up into the dark void of the sinkhole. "I haven't been outside in 4 years," he said. His voice was barely audible over the drumming of the water. "We need weapons, Van," I said, pulling my collar up. "The syndicate controls the transit lifts, and below that, the sump is a war zone. I don't use swords, scribe, clumsy things. They lack imagination." He started walking, not toward the main thoroughfare, but into the alleyways. He moved differently now. In the bar, he shuffled. Here, in the shadows, he glided, the predator remembering its hunting grounds. We arrived at a statue in a small, flooded square. It was an old monument to a long-dead matriarch, her stone face chipped away by vandals, leaving her faceless. Van knelt at the base of the statue. He felt around the stone plinth until his fingers found a loose block. "Buried treasure?" I asked. "Buried sins," he corrected. He pulled the stone free. Behind it was a cavity wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled out a bundle. He unwrapped it in the rain. First, the coat. Purple velvet. Once it had been vibrant, the color of kings. Now it was faded, stained with grime and time. It looked like a bruised fruit. Next, the bandolier. Leather pouches filled with glass vials. Some glowed with faint bioluminescence. Others were dark as pitch. And finally, the tin. Van held the small metal tin in his hand. He stared at it for a long time. The rain washed over his face, indistinguishable from tears he wasn't crying. "Putting it on doesn't make you him," I said quietly. I wanted to reassure him. Van looked at me. The lightning flashed, illuminating the hollows of his eyes. "That's the lie we tell ourselves, Kalen. We think we wear the mask, but eventually, the mask wears us." He opened the tin. White paste, red grease. He dipped his fingers in the white. He didn't need a mirror. His hands knew the contours of his face. He smeared the white across his cheeks, his forehead, his nose. He dragged the red across his lips, extending the line up toward his ears. When he turned back to me, Van the bartender was gone. The man standing in the rain was a nightmare. The smile was too wide. The eyes were too dead. "Well, scribe," the jester said, spreading his arms. The voice was higher now, sharper. "Does it look like a tragedy yet?" "It looks like war," I said. "Good," he whispered, slipping the last vial into his sleeve. "Because I intend to win this time." 12. The threshold of rust. To get to the sump, you have to cross the gizzard. It used to be the industrial heart of Cenote. Now, it was a graveyard of machines. The great cogworks that once powered the lifts stood silent, rusted into sculptures of neglect. We walked along the catwalks suspended over the ventilation shafts. Below us, the red glow of the geothermal vents pulsed like an infection. "Hold," Van hissed. He pulled me into the shadow of a smokestack. Ahead of us, the catwalk was blocked. A makeshift checkpoint, barbed wire and scrap metal. 4 men sat around a burning barrel, playing cards. They wore the iron armbands of the syndicate. "The lift is behind them," I whispered. "I can take the 2 on the left. Can you handle the others?" "Kill them?" Van asked. He sounded bored. How dull. Killing is so permanent. It leaves no room for a sequel. They will kill us given the chance. Watch and learn, scribe. Van stepped out of the shadows. He walked right down the center of the metal walkway, his boots clanking loudly on the grate. The guards jumped up. They drew serrated blades and pipe clubs. "Halt!" the biggest one shouted. This is iron territory. The toll is—" He stopped. He saw the purple coat. He saw the white face. He saw the red smile bleeding in the rain. Van didn't stop. He walked with a loose, limber gait, like a puppet with cut strings. "Gentlemen," Van shouted. His voice echoed off the metal walls. "I seem to have lost my invitation to the party downstairs. Could you point me to the nearest elevator?" The guards backed away. They were young, maybe 20. They were children when the purple fog fell. To them, the jester wasn't a man. He was a boogeyman. He was the demon parents told their kids about to make them behave. "It's him," one guard whispered, his voice trembling. "The ghost of the vent." "Shoot him!" the leader screamed, raising a crossbow. Van didn't dodge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of dust. He blew it gently toward them. It wasn't poison. It was flash spores. Crack, boom. A blinding white light engulfed the catwalk, followed by a sound like a thunderclap. The guards screamed, dropping their weapons, clutching their eyes. Van walked past them while they were blind. He didn't strike them. He didn't even look at them. He just stepped over the leader who was curled up on the floor. As we passed the checkpoint and reached the lift controls, Van turned to me. "Fear, Kalen," he said, pulling the lever to summon the cage. "It is the most potent reagent in alchemy. It turns brave men into children and steel into butter." The lift cage arrived with a screech of metal. We stepped inside. Van looked at the unconscious guards one last time. "Besides," he muttered, wiping a speck of ash from his velvet lapel, "if I killed them, who would tell the story that I'm back?" He slammed the gate shut. The lift jerked and began its long, screaming descent into the dark. Toward the sump. Toward Alara. 13. The Garden of Forgotten Sins. The lift didn't stop. It died. The cables ran out of length, and the cage settled into the muck with a soft, sucking sound. We were at the bottom of the world. I expected darkness. I expected the smell of rot. I was wrong. "Don't breathe too deeply, scribe," Van whispered, adjusting the velvet collar of his coat. He pulled 2 filtration masks from his satchel. They looked like brass insects. "The air down here is spirited." We stepped out of the cage. The sump was not a sewer anymore. It was a forest. But not a forest of wood and leaf. It was a forest of fungi. Towering mushrooms, tall as cathedral spires, spiraled up into the gloom. They pulsed with bioluminescent light, sickly greens, bruised purples, electric blues. The ground was a carpet of thick velvet moss that moved slightly when we stepped on it, as if it were breathing. "Beautiful," Van murmured. He reached out and touched a glowing fern. It curled away from his finger like a shy animal. "You did this?" I asked, my voice muffled by the brass mask. "I introduced the catalyst," Van said. "Evolution did the rest. It seems the silver dust and the Veritas gas found a way to mate in the dark." We walked deeper. The path was a labyrinth of glowing roots. It was quiet. Too quiet. There were no rats, no insects, just the sound of water dripping from the massive fungal caps high above. Suddenly, I felt it, a prickle at the base of my neck. "Van," I whispered, "we are being watched." Van stopped. He didn't turn. He stood perfectly still, blending into the surreal landscape like a poisonous flower. "I know," he said. "Do not draw your sword, Kalen. Violence here triggers the spores. If you attack, the forest itself will digest you." I took my hand off my hilt. From the shadows of the glowing mushrooms, shapes began to detach themselves. They were human, or they had been. They were pale, their skin translucent, revealing the network of blue veins beneath. They wore no armor, only rags woven from fungal silk. But it was their faces that froze my blood. They wore glass masks. complex, airtight apparatuses filled with a swirling pink mist. They were breathing the gas continuously. They didn't look angry. They didn't look violent. They looked peaceful, blissful. "The children of the vapor," Van said softly. He stepped forward, spreading his arms, his painted smile gleaming in the phosphorescent light. "Hello, my lovelies," he called out. "I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." The figures didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared at him with eyes that were dilated so wide they were almost entirely black. Then, one of them stepped forward. A woman. She drifted rather than walked. She tilted her head. "We can hear your heartbeat, stranger," she said. Her voice was muffled by the glass, but it sounded inside my head, sweet and invasive. "It beats with fear. Why are you afraid of love?" "I'm not afraid of love," Van replied, bowing. "I'm afraid of commitment." The woman stopped. She looked at Van's painted face. She looked at the purple coat. A ripple went through the crowd of pale figures. They didn't attack. They fell to their knees. 14. The Prophet of Paradox. "Father," the woman whispered. The word echoed through the cavern. "Father, Father, Father." Hundreds of them were kneeling now, their heads bowed into the glowing moss. They weren't worshipping a god. They were worshipping the architect of their madness. I looked at Van. For the first time since I met him, the jester looked unsettled. His painted smile remained fixed, but his hands were clenched in fists at his sides. "I am not your father," Van said, his voice hard. "I am just a tourist." "You gave us the breath," the woman said, standing up. She walked closer. I could see the condensation of the pink gas inside her mask. Before the breath, we were alone in our heads. We had secrets. Secrets are cancer. Now, we are open. She reached out a pale hand. "We know you, Van of the Deep. We feel your regret. It tastes like ash." Van took a step back. This was the one thing he couldn't fight with chemistry or wit. He was facing radical, weaponized empathy. "Where is she?" Van asked. "Where is Alara?" The woman smiled behind her glass. It was a terrifying, serene smile. "Mother is in the chrysalis," she said. "She is preparing the great exhale. Soon the whole city will be like us. No more secrets, no more pain, just us." "The great exhale," I repeated. "Van, that sounds like—" "A massive atmospheric release," Van finished. "She's going to pump the concentrated gas into the geothermal vents. The pressure will blow it all the way to the stratosphere. It won't just cover the city, it will cover the continent." "Global lobotomy," I muttered. Van looked at the woman. "Take me to her." "Only the pure may enter the chrysalis," the woman said. Her tone shifted. It wasn't aggressive, but it was final. "You are still clouded, Father. You still hide behind your paint and your jokes. You must be cleansed." The cultists stood up in unison. 100 glass masks turned toward us. "Breathe," they chanted softly. "Breathe, breathe." They pulled canisters from their robes. Not weapons, sensors. They began to swing them, releasing thick clouds of the pink gas. "Masks tight," Van shouted to me. He reached into his bandolier and pulled out a vial of black liquid. Flash tar. "Run, Kalen." Van threw the vial at the ground. It didn't explode with light. It exploded with darkness. A cloud of heavy, opaque black smoke billowed out, instantly blinding the cultists. "This way." Van grabbed my arm and pulled me off the path, plunging us into the dense, glowing jungle of mushrooms. Behind us, the chanting didn't stop. It didn't even sound angry. It sounded sad. "Why do you run from yourself?" they called out. "Why do you run from the truth?" We scrambled over slippery roots and through curtains of hanging moss. The air was getting hotter. We were getting closer to the vents. We stopped behind a massive stalk to catch our breath. My filter mask was wheezing. "They aren't fighting us," I gasped. "They're trying to convert us." Van wiped a smear of black sludge from his purple coat. His eyes were wide. "It's worse than I thought," he whispered. "Vespera used the gas to break people. Ilara is using it to merge them. She's creating a hive mind, Kalen. And if she succeeds, humanity ends. We won't be individuals anymore. We'll just be soup." He checked his belt. 3 vials left. "We need to get to the geothermal heart," Van said. "But we can't sneak past them. They can hear our adrenaline." "So what do we do?" Van looked at me. Then he looked at the glowing spores drifting in the air. "If we can't hide," the jester said, a dangerous idea forming in his eyes, "then we have to put on a show so loud they can't look away." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metallic object. It looked like a flute, but carved from bone. "Do you know how to dance, scribe?" "No." "Pity," Van grinned, and for a second the fear was gone. "You're about to learn." 15. The Marionettes of Silence. We were running through the neon-lit jungle when the ground began to tremble. Not an earthquake, something shallower. "Van," I gasped, sliding to a halt in the muck. "The roots, they're moving." Van knelt, ignoring the cultists pursuing us in the distance. He touched the moss. "Not roots," he whispered. "Wires." Suddenly the mulch exploded ahead of us. A hand shot out of the earth, then another. But these were not the pale, soft hands of the cultists. These were gray, desiccated, preserved. Bodies pulled themselves from the soil. They were miners who had died in the sump years ago, their bodies mummified by the chemical peat. But they weren't rotting. They were woven. Thick, glowing blue veins of fungus pulsed beneath their dry skin, wrapping around their limbs like external muscles. Their eyes were gone, replaced by clusters of glowing spores. They didn't shamble like the monsters in fairy tales. They moved with terrifying, jerky speed, snap, snap, slide, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. "Necromancy," I swore, drawing my sword. "No," Van corrected, his voice filled with a horrifying awe. "Mycelial reinnervation." He stood up, watching the circle of dead men close around us. "It's genius," Van murmured. "The brain dies, Kalen. But the nerves? The nerves are just copper wiring waiting for a signal. She's replaced their central nervous systems with the fungal network. She isn't raising the dead. She's recycling them." The dead men stopped. They tilted their heads in unison. A voice resonated from them. Not from their mouths. Their vocal cords were dust, but vibrating from the hollow cavities of their chests. "Van." It was Ilara's voice, distorted, layered, coming from 20 dead throats at once. "You brought logic to a world of feeling. Why do you resist the connection?" The dead men raised their hands. They weren't attacking. They were reaching out. "She's controlling them remotely," Van said, analyzing them rapidly. "She's the signal. They are the receivers." "Can you jam the signal?" I asked, swinging my sword to sever the head of the nearest corpse. The body didn't stop. It just kept moving, headless. "You can't kill what isn't alive, scribe," Van shouted. "The fungus is the pilot. You have to disrupt the chemical frequency." He reached into his bandolier. "Ilara!" Van shouted at the circle of corpses. "This isn't life. This is puppetry." "It is togetherness," the corpses replied. "Join us, Van. We are so lonely without your mind." And in that moment, the horror shifted. I saw the look on Van's face. It wasn't just fear. It was longing. He looked at these abominations and he didn't see monsters. He saw her. He saw the woman he loved reaching out through the only medium she had left, death itself. "I'm coming, Ilara," Van whispered, He dropped his flash vials. He raised his hands empty. "Van, no!" I yelled. But the corpses didn't tear him apart. They gently took his arms. The glowing blue veins on their skin pulsed faster, and I saw the spores drift from their bodies into Van's breath. He gasped. His eyes rolled back. He wasn't dying. He was logging in. 16. The Synaptic Kiss. The world dissolved. Gravity vanished. I was no longer standing in the sump. I was floating in a vast, endless web of blue light. I could hear them. Not voices, but impulses. 1,000 thoughts screaming at once. Hunger, fear, joy. The cultists, the dead, the rats. Everything connected to the mycelium. It was overwhelming. A tsunami of data. Then, the noise parted. She was there. Ilara. She stood in the center of the void. She didn't look like the cult leader. She looked like the girl in the high garden, wearing the silk dress she tore the night the world ended. But her skin was made of starlight, and her hair was a cascade of glowing roots. "Hello, Jester," she said. Her voice wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. It felt like warm rain. "Ilara," I thought, "what have you done?" She stepped closer. The distance between us collapsed instantly. In this place, space was just a suggestion. "I fixed it, Van. You broke the hierarchy, but you left them broken. I knitted them back together. I hold them. When they die, I don't let them go into the dark. I keep them." She reached out and cupped my face. Her touch sent a jolt of pure electricity through my soul. It was intimacy beyond skin. She was reading my memories. She was tasting my regret. "I can feel your guilt," she whispered. "It's so heavy. Why carry it alone? Give it to the network. Give it to me." I wanted to. God, I wanted to surrender, to stop being Van the survivor, Van the murderer. "It's necromancy, Ilara," I projected back. "It's stagnation. Life is defined by its end. If you don't let them die, they can't truly live." She smiled. Sad. Beautiful. That is the alchemist talking, the man who measures the world in dosages. She leaned in. Her forehead touched mine. "Look closer, Van. Don't look with your logic. Look with your heart." She kissed me. It wasn't a physical kiss. It was a synaptic merge. For a second, our minds became one. I saw the world through her eyes. I didn't see horror. I saw a symphony. I felt the comfort the dead felt. No pain, no cold, just the warm hum of the hive. I felt her love for me, preserved perfectly in the amber of her mind, untouched by the years. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. And it terrified me. I pulled back. I tore my mind away from hers with a mental scream. The web shattered. I slammed back into my body. I gasped, sucking in air that tasted of mud and mold. I was on my knees in the sump. The dead men had released me. They stood frozen, awaiting orders. Kalen was standing over me, sword drawn, looking terrified. "Van, what happened? You were seizing." I looked up at him. I was shaking. I could still feel her taste in my mind. Electric, addictive. "I saw her," I rasped. I wiped blood from my nose. "She isn't just controlling them, Kalen. She loves them. She's building a heaven out of corpses. Can we stop her?" I stood up. My legs felt weak, but my mind was racing with a new, terrible understanding. "The chrysalis," I said, pointing toward the massive, throbbing structure in the center of the fungal forest. "She's hooked into the main geothermal generator. She's using the Earth's heat to power the psychic signal." "We destroy the generator?" "No," I said. I touched my lips, remembering the phantom kiss. "If we destroy the generator, the shockback will scramble her brain. It will kill her instantly." "Van," Kalen warned, "we can't save her." I looked at the scribe. The old Van would have agreed. The old Van would have done the math. But the jester? The jester had just felt a love that transcended death. I have a new plan, I said. I'm not going to destroy the network. I pulled out a vial of clear, unrefined solvent. I'm going to infect it. 17th. The solvent of dreams. I'm not killing the network, Van said, his hands shaking as he uncorked the vial of clear solvent. I'm introducing a new variable, a chaotic element. What is it? I asked, eyeing the circle of frozen dead men, the preserved, who stood like statues around us. Lysergic acid, distilled from the ghost cap mushroom, mixed with a highly conductive saline solution, Van muttered. If Alara's network relies on perfect, synchronized order, let's see how it handles a little jazz. He didn't inject it into a body. He injected it into the ground, directly into a pulsing blue mycelial vein, as thick as a man's arm. The effect was instantaneous, and it wasn't what Van expected. The ground didn't just absorb the liquid, it gasped. A shockwave of color rippled out from the injection site. It wasn't light, it was a shift in perception. The gloom of the sump turned into a kaleidoscope of fractal patterns. The green bioluminescence split into spectrums I didn't have names for. Breathe, scribe, Van whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from inside my own skull. The spores, they are broadcasting the hallucination. Suddenly, gravity tilted. I wasn't standing on mud anymore. I was standing on a membrane. Below me, I could see the city, not as buildings but as a nervous system. I saw the throat, a blinding white knot of greed, where nobles consumed light like parasites. I saw the gut, a churning stomach of labor and sweat. I saw the sump, a glowing brain pulsing with the thoughts of the dead. And I saw her. Alara appeared in the chaos of colors. She wasn't human-sized. She was a giant, woven from starlight and roots, towering over the mental landscape. But she wasn't attacking. She was weeping. Her tears were falling as data. I could taste them. They tasted like lost childhoods, like the memory of a first kiss, like the fear of dying alone. You are flooding the lines, Van. Her voice boomed, vibrating through my teeth. Too much feeling. It hurts. It's too beautiful. Van fell to his knees, clutching his head. It's not a weapon, he screamed. It's a mirror. I'm showing the network its own subconscious. But then, the vision shifted. The bad trip began. Shadows encroached on the edges of the fractal paradise. I saw other shapes in the web. Not Alara, not the cult. I saw watchers, silhouettes of men in heavy coats, observing the network from the outside. They were tapping the lines. They weren't part of the hive mind, they were stealing from it. I saw ledgers. I saw gold changing hands. I saw the preserved being sold like cattle. Van! I yelled, trying to grab him, but my hand passed through his shoulder like smoke. Someone else is here. In the vision, there are others. Van looked up, his eyes dilated, swimming in the drug-induced haze. The Ashen Guild, he whispered, seeing what I saw. They aren't just scavenging, they're harvesting. The ground convulsed. The dose of acid had triggered a purge. The preserved, the dead men surrounding us, suddenly screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of 1,000 minds experiencing ego death simultaneously. The shockwave blasted us backward. The colors shattered into gray. The fractals dissolved into mud. We were back in the sump, wet, cold, terrified. But the silence was gone. The sump was awake. 18. The economics of the dead. We lay in the mud, gasping for air. The after-images of the trip still danced in my peripheral vision, tracers of blue light trailing every movement. Did you see them? Van coughed, wiping bile from his mouth. The men in the shadows? I saw them, I said. Who are they? The Ashen Guild. Puh, Van spat. I thought they were just rumors. scavengers who picked over the ruins of the old factories. But they've evolved. Before I could ask more, a spotlight cut through the gloom. It came from a massive, steam-powered dirigible hovering silently above the fungal canopy. It wasn't a council ship. It was rusted, reinforced with scrap metal, painted with the symbol of a cog wreathed in ash. Ropes dropped. Men descended. They weren't cultists. These were soldiers. Mercenaries clad in exoskeletons powered by hissing pneumatic pistons. They carried shock staves, weapons designed to stun, not kill. They weren't here for us. They were here for the preserved. I watched, paralyzed, as the ashen soldiers moved with practiced efficiency. They approached the circle of confused, twitching corpses, the ones Van had just disconnected from Alara's control. "Bag and tag," the leader shouted. His voice was amplified by a brass voxcaster. "High-grade specimens. The matriarchs of the Western Rift will pay double for intact nervous systems." They fired nets. Weighted, electrified nets that wrapped around the preserved. The dead men struggled, but without Alara's guiding signal, which Van had just disrupted, they were clumsy. They were tackled, bound, and hoisted up toward the airship. "They're stealing them," I whispered, realizing the horror of the economy. "Labor," Van said, his voice cold. "The cult thinks the dead are sacred. The guild knows they are profitable. No need for food, no need for sleep. Perfect soldiers, perfect miners." "We have to stop them," I said, reaching for my sword. "No," Van grabbed my wrist. "Look." From the deeper darkness of the forest, the cult emerged. The children of the vapor. But they weren't chanting love songs anymore. Ilara's interruption via the drug had passed, and her protective instinct had kicked in. The cultists didn't carry weapons. They carried glass orbs filled with concentrated spores. They ran toward the ashen soldiers with suicidal fearlessness. One cultist threw an orb at a soldier. It shattered against his exosuit. The spores didn't hurt the metal, but they found the air intake. The soldier screamed. He tore at his helmet. Inside, I could see his face twisting as the fungi rapidly bloomed in his lungs, suffocating him with truth. It was a three-way war. The guild with their technology, the cult with their biology, and us, caught in the middle. "This is the world I made," Van murmured, watching the carnage. "A war between those who want to use the dead for profit and those who want to use them for prayer." "We can't stay here," I said. "If the guild sees us..." "They already have." The leader of the Ashen Squad turned. His helmet optics flared red. He pointed a hydraulic gauntlet at us. "Witnesses," he barked. "Secure the jester. The guildmaster wants a word with the man who invented the product." 3 soldiers detached from the main fray and stomped toward us, their shock staves crackling with blue electricity. Van looked at me. He didn't have any vials left. He looked tired. "Scribe," he said, "do you know anything about the politics of the Ashen Guild?" "No." "Neither do I, but I suspect they don't have a sense of humor." Van raised his hands, surrendering. "Take me," he shouted at the soldiers, "but leave the boy. He's just a critic." "Van, what are you doing?" I hissed. "Expanding the plot," he whispered, winking. "We need a ride out of the sump, and I'd rather travel in their airship than walk." 19. The Neon Vein. They didn't take us to a prison cell. They took us to a party. The Ashen Guild's airship docked at the Turbine, a massive cylindrical nightclub built inside one of the defunct ventilation fans of Sector 3. The blades were stationary now, serving as floors and balconies, bathed in flickering neon lights, harsh pinks, electric blues, and toxic greens. Van and I were marched through the service entrance, hands bound with magnetic cuffs. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not rain. It smelled of synthesized perfume, ozone, and burning sugar. "Welcome to civilization," Van muttered, looking around with a mix of fascination and revulsion. The club was packed, but not with miners or beggars. These were the new elite of the Anarchy: smugglers, syndicate lieutenants, and mercenaries. They wore leather and chrome, their skin pale from living in the dark, their eyes bright with chemical joy. We walked past booths upholstered in velvet. I looked closer at the waiters. They moved with that jerky, sliding gait I had seen in the sump. They were preserved. Dead men and women, dressed in tuxedos and corsets, carrying trays of drinks. Their eyes were replaced with glowing red optical lenses. The glowing blue fungus, Ilara's mark, had been surgically suppressed, replaced by guild machinery. "Look at them," Van whispered. "Lobotomized. She gives them a soul. Moorgrave turns them into furniture." A waiter stumbled near us. A patron, a woman with a metal jaw, kicked the corpse. "Faster, rotbag," she laughed, snorting a line of glowing blue powder off the table. "Glimmer," Van noted, watching the powder. "A stimulant derived from the phosphorescent moss. It makes you feel like you're flying. Then it eats your serotonin receptors until you can't feel happiness ever again without it." "It's an epidemic," I said. "The council tries to ban it, but—" "The council?" Van laughed dryly. "The council buys it, Kalen. Look over there." He nodded toward a VIP booth. I saw a man I recognized, Councillor Vane. He was slumped on a couch, a needle sticking out of his arm, injecting a thick black liquid. Void tar, the heroin of the depths. "The economy of the dead isn't just about labor," Van said as the guards shoved us forward. "It's about escapism. The dead work so the living can dream." We were pushed through a heavy blast door at the back of the club. The music faded to a dull thrum. The air became colder, cleaner. "Why are you here, scribe?" Van asked suddenly, his voice low. "You fight too well for a historian. You know the drug trade too well for a scholar." I hesitated. I looked at the jester, the man who had broken the world. "I grew up in the orphanage Vespera defunded," I said quietly. "I didn't learn history from books, Van. I learned it from watching my friends overdose on the very dust you unleashed. I'm not here to write your legend. I'm here to make sure it ends correctly." Van looked at me. For a moment, the painted smile seemed to droop. "Good," he said. "Everyone needs an editor." The doors to the inner sanctum opened. 20. The Merchant of Silence. The office of Guildmaster Moorgrave was a glass box suspended over the dance floor. Through the floor we could see the chaos of the party below, but up here it was a sanctuary of silence. Moorgrave sat behind a desk made of polished bone. He was a handsome man in a terrifying way. His skin was too smooth, likely grafted. His eyes were silver implants that whirred faintly when he blinked. He wore a suit of white silk, immaculate, without a single speck of the city's grime. He didn't look up from his ledger as we entered. "The jester," Moorgrave said. His voice was soft, cultured, a violin bow drawn across a raw nerve. "And the scribe. Kalen, isn't it? Your reports to the council are dry, but accurate." I froze. He knew. "You have spies in the council," I said. Moorgrave finally looked up. He smiled. It wasn't Van's manic grin. It was a surgical incision. "I own the council, boy. They rent the city. I hold the mortgage." He stood up and walked to a glass display case. Inside was a severed arm. It was gray, pulsing with blue veins. A specimen from the sump. "Van," Moorgrave turned to the alchemist. "I am an admirer of your work. The Veritas gas? Crude but effective market disruption. But this, the mycelial reinnervation? This is art." "It's an abomination," Van said. He refused to look at the arm. It is efficiency, Moregrave corrected. Do you know how much it costs to feed a miner, Van? To heal them when they break a leg? To pay their pension when they get old? It is wasted capital. Moregrave walked over to Van. He circled him like a shark. Your friend, Ilara. She is a visionary, but she is a sentimentalist. She lets the dead dream. She lets them feel. That makes them erratic, unstable product. Moregrave leaned in close. I have a client in the Western Rift, a warlord. He needs 10,000 soldiers who don't feel fear, don't sleep, and don't hesitate. I have the bodies, but the software is buggy. You want me to fix them, Van realized. You want me to strip the empathy out of the network. You want to turn Ilara's heaven into a factory. I want you to stabilize the formula, Moregrave said. Remove the soul, keep the motor functions, simple chemistry. And if I refuse? Moregrave sighed. He pressed a button on his desk. A screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed a live feed from the club below, but not the dance floor, the kitchen. We saw a line of preserved, chopping vegetables, but among them was a living girl. She looked about 16. She was chained to a stove. The supply of fresh bodies is always fluctuating, Moregrave said casually. Sometimes we have to accelerate the process. We have thousands of debtors in our prisons, Van. If you don't help me stabilize the dead, I will have to keep harvesting the living. It's simple math. Van went rigid. I saw his hands clench in the magnetic cuffs. This was the trap, the psychological checkmate. You are a monster, I spat. I am a businessman, Kalen, Moregrave replied, sitting back down. And business is booming. He slid a glass of clear water across the desk toward Van. You have access to the sump. You understand the chemical language of the fungus. Go back down. Use your solvent. Sever Ilara's connection to the bodies but leave the motor functions intact. Bring me the master key to the network. Moregrave's silver eyes narrowed. Do this and I give you Ilara. I will extract her from the chrysalis. I have the best surgeons. We can cut the fungus out. We can save her life. She will hate you, of course, but she will be alive. The room went silent. It was the impossible choice. Save Ilara's life by destroying her life's work and enslaving thousands of souls? Or let her rot in the sump, slowly losing her mind to the hive? Van looked at the water. He looked at the screen with the girl in the kitchen. Then he looked at me. Kalen, Van said, his voice hollow. Do you remember what I told you in the bar? About the difference between tragedy and comedy? Lighting, I whispered. Exactly. Van looked back at Moregrave. I'll do it. 21st. The Chair of Whispers. Excellent, Moregrave said, leaning back in his chair. I knew you were a pragmatist, Van. Van stood up, rolling his shoulders, the magnetic cuffs still humming on his wrists. Unlock these, Van said, nodding at the cuffs, and give me a list of your available chemical reagents. If I'm going to lobotomize a god, I need my toolkit. We leave for the sump within the hour. That was the plan. I saw it in Van's eyes. Get free, get equipped, get out. Moregrave didn't reach for the key. He reached for his glass of water, took a sip and smiled. A smile that didn't reach his silver eyes. Leave, Moregrave chuckled softly. Oh, Jester, you really are stuck in the past. You think geography matters. He pressed a button on his desk. The floor beneath us didn't open. It vibrated. The walls of the office, the sleek, soundproof glass, suddenly turned opaque. The view of the club vanished. The room was sealing itself. I don't need you to go to the sump, Van, Moregrave said, standing up. The sump is dirty. It's inefficient. And frankly, I don't trust you out of my sight. The network is biological, Van argued, taking a step back, but his legs wobbled. He grabbed the desk for support. I need to physically inject the solvent into the primary node. Incorrect, Moregrave said. The network is signal-based. Ilara broadcasts a frequency. Mycelium conducts bioelectricity. And do you know what else conducts electricity? The wall behind Moregrave slid open. Revealed was not a weapon rack, but a machine. A nightmare of brass, glass, and pulsating organic matter. In the center was a chair. Connected to the chair were thick cables that ran into a large glass tank. Inside the tank, suspended in nutrient gel, was a massive chunk of blue, glowing fungus, a piece of the chrysalis itself, harvested and kept alive. A repeater node, Van whispered, his face draining of color. The drug in the air, or perhaps the drink Moregrave had offered earlier, was taking hold. His speech was slurring. I stole a piece of her brain years ago, Moregrave admitted. But I couldn't crack the encryption. The network rejected my scientists. It burned out their minds. It needs an administrator, someone with root access. Moregrave walked around the desk. 2 heavy pneumatic guards stepped out of the shadows of the machine room. You shared a synaptic kiss with her, Van. You told the scribe yourself. Her mind knows you. It trusts you. No, Van gasped. He tried to raise his hands, to cast a spell of flash powder, but his fingers wouldn't obey. Paralytic agent, fast-acting. I'm not sending you to the sump to inject a poison, Moregrave said, as the guards grabbed Van and dragged him toward the chair. I'm going to strap you into this chair. I'm going to jack your nervous system directly into my repeater node. And then, I'm going to use your voice, your love, and your admin privileges to issue the command to every corpse in the city. The command! I shouted, pulling at my own restraints, realizing with horror that we had walked straight into the slaughterhouse. Moregrave looked at me. The command to format drive, he said coldly. Total wipe of higher functions, reset to factory settings. They threw Van into the chair. Clamps slammed down on his wrists and ankles. A metal halo was lowered onto his head. Kalen! Van screamed, his eyes wild with panic. Real panic, not the theatrical kind. Run! Don't let him... A needle, thick as a finger, punched into the base of Van's skull. He arched his back. His scream was cut off as the machine roared to life. The blue fungus in the tank flared blindingly bright. Van wasn't the operator. He was the antenna. 22. The signal in the blood. The room exploded with invisible pressure. When the machine connected Van to the piece of the hive mind, it didn't just stay in the tank. The signal amplified. The glass walls of the office shook. Moregrave stood behind a control console, frantically adjusting dials. Stabilize the link. Filter out the emotional data. I just want the motor cortex. Van was convulsing in the chair. Froth gathered at the corner of his mouth. His painted smile was twisted into a rictus of agony. I felt it too, because I was in the room. A wave of grief. It hit me like a physical punch. It wasn't my grief. It was hers. It was Ilara's confusion. She felt Van's mind enter the network, but it was wrong. It was twisted by Moregrave's machine. Van? The voice echoed in the room, coming from the speakers, coming from the fungus, coming from the fillings in my teeth. Why are you hurting us? Ignore the audio, Moregrave shouted at his technicians. Execute the purge protocol. I saw my chance. The guards were distracted by the psychic shockwave. They were clutching their helmets, noses bleeding. The glimmer in their blood, the drug made from the moss, was reacting to the signal. Moregrave hadn't accounted for that. Half his men were addicts, and now the signal was turning their own blood against them. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the scribe's only weapon. I grabbed the heavy, iron-bound ledger Moregrave had been writing in. I swung it with all my strength. Crack! It connected with the back of the nearest guard's knee. The exoskeleton buckled. He went down. I scrambled for his shock stave. My hands fumbled with the activation rune. "Stop him!" Morgrave yelled, pulling a pistol from his white suit. He fired. The bullet grazed my shoulder. The guards of searing heat. I didn't stop. I rolled under the console table. I looked up at Van. He was staring at the ceiling, his eyes glowing solid blue. He was gone. He was battling Alara on a psychic plane I couldn't reach, while Morgrave used his body as a battering ram. I couldn't save Van. Not here. Not now. If I stayed, I died. If I died, no one would know what Morgrave was doing. No one would warn the resistance. I saw a ventilation grate near the floor. The irony. The jester's favorite exit. I kicked the grate. It was rusted. It gave way. "Seal the room," Morgrave commanded. I squeezed into the vent just as a second bullet sparked against the metal frame. I scrambled into the dark, sliding down into the guts of the turbine. Behind me, I could hear Van screaming. But it wasn't a scream of pain anymore. It was a scream of commands. "Sleep. Obey. Reset." And below me, in the club, the music stopped. I peered through a grate looking down at the dance floor. The waiters, the preserved, had stopped moving. The patrons who were high on glimmer had collapsed, seizing. Morgrave had done it. He had hijacked the signal. But he hadn't just enslaved the dead. He had crashed the minds of everyone in the city who had the fungus in their blood. I slid deeper into the dark, bleeding, alone. The jester was captured. The villain had won. And the war had just changed from a battle for territory to a battle for the human mind. 23. The City of Clockwork Men. 6 months. That's how long it takes to break a city. You don't need bombs. You don't need gas. You just need a rhythm. I sat on the gargoyle overlooking the plaza of the Throat. It was raining as always, but no one ran for cover. Below me, thousands of citizens walked in perfect unison. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. They were the hollows. They weren't dead, not technically. Their hearts beat, their lungs filled with air. But their eyes were empty, reflecting the neon advertisements of the Ashen Guild that towered over the square. "Work is virtue," a holographic billboard proclaimed. "Silence is safety." My name is Kalen. I used to write history. Now I edit it. I checked the pocket watch in my hand. 3 a.m. Shift change at the helium refineries. Target approaching, a voice whispered in my earpiece. It was Jinx, a street rat from Sector 4, 12 years old, never touched Glimmer. One of the few clears left. "I see him," I replied. My voice was rougher now. Less ink, more gravel. A transport hover skiff glided silently through the rain. It carried cargo crates marked with the guild's cogwheel, but it wasn't carrying ore. It was carrying processors, freshly harvested brains from the sump, destined for Morgrave's servers. I stood up. I wasn't wearing my scribe's robes. I wore a coat made of ballistic weave, stolen from a dead guard. On my back was the shock stave I had taken from the turbine. I had modified it. It didn't stun anymore. It burned. "Remember the plan, Jinx," I said. "Distraction only. Do not engage." "Copy that, Ghost," the boy replied. Down in the plaza, a firework went off. It wasn't one of Van's beautiful, colorful displays. It was a crude, dirty explosion of magnesium. A flashbang. The hollows didn't scream. They just stopped walking, their heads twitching as the signal in their blood tried to process the disruption. The hover skiff swerved slightly, its automated pilot confused by the sudden light. That was all I needed. I jumped. I fell 3 stories, my coat snapping in the wind. I didn't use a glider. I used a grapple gun, another theft from the guild. The hook bit into the metal hull of the skiff. The jolt nearly dislocated my shoulder, but I held on. I swung up, vaulting over the railing. 2 guild guards stood on the deck. They weren't hollows. They were mercenaries, paid to be awake. "Boarder!" one shouted, raising a rifle. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I slid across the wet deck, activating the shock stave. The tip glowed white-hot. I swept the legs of the first guard. He went down screaming, a sound that felt shockingly loud in the silent city. The second guard fired. The bullet sparked off my shoulder plate. I lunged, driving the stave into his chest plate. The electricity fried his suit's servos. He froze, locked in his own armor. I walked to the cargo crates. I smashed the lock. Inside were glass jars, brains, floating in blue fluid. I felt bile rise in my throat. This was Morgrave's computer. This was what Van had become part of. I pulled a satchel of charges from my belt. "Forgive me," I whispered to the jars. I set the timer. 5 seconds. I jumped off the skiff, firing my grapple toward a nearby rooftop. As I swung away into the shadows, the skiff exploded behind me. A ball of fire that briefly illuminated the sleeping, zombie-like faces of the city below. They didn't look up. They just kept walking. Left foot, right foot. I landed on the roof, breathless, my heart hammering a rhythm that was all my own. 6 months ago, I would have vomited. Tonight, I just checked my watch. 3:05 a.m. Schedule kept. I disappeared into the night. But I knew Morgrave was watching. Somewhere in his tower, a light on a console had just turned red. The scribe was rewriting the script, one explosion at a time. 24. The warmth of stale coffee. The safe house smelled of iodine, wet wool, and something miraculously rare, roasted beans. It wasn't a fortress. It was a maintenance crawl space behind the neon sign of an abandoned noodle shop in Sector 5. The neon buzzed intermittently, bathing the room in a rhythmic, dying pink light. I sat on a crate, shirtless, shivering. The adrenaline from the raid had faded, leaving only the dull throb of the bullet graze on my shoulder. "Hold still," a voice said, "or I'll stitch your shirt to your skin." Rhea. She wasn't a soldier. She was a mechanic who used to fix the atmospheric scrubbers. Her hands were stained permanently with grease and carbon, but her touch was precise. She held a curved needle and a spool of synthetic thread. "It's deep, Kalen," she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the wound. "You're lucky the armor took the heat. Another inch, and you'd be losing the arm." "Luck is a strategy," I grunted, flinching as the needle pierced the skin. "Luck is a finite resource," she countered. She tied off the stitch and snipped the thread with her teeth. She finally looked at me. Rhea had eyes the color of slate, gray, unreadable, but harboring a quiet storm. She didn't fear the world the way I did. She endured it. She stood up and walked to a small hot plate in the corner. She poured a dark liquid into a chipped mug and handed it to me. "Real coffee?" I asked, inhaling the steam. It smelled like earth. It smelled like the time before the signal. "I traded 3 battery cells for a bag," she said, leaning against the damp wall, crossing her arms. "Drink it. You look like a corpse." I took a sip. It was bitter, burnt, and scalding hot. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. For a moment, the war didn't exist. Morgrave didn't exist. It was just the heat of the mug in my hands, and the woman watching me with a mixture of judgment and worry. "Why do you do it, Rhea?" I asked softly. "You could take the glimmer. You could sleepwalk through this hell like everyone else. It's painless." She looked at the pink light pulsing through the cracks in the wall. "My brother took the glimmer," she said. Her voice was flat, but I heard the crack underneath. "I saw him yesterday in the street. He looked right at me. He didn't blink. He just existed. Being in pain means I'm still me, Kalen. I'd rather hurt than be hollow." She reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from my forehead. Her fingers were rough, but the gesture was shockingly tender. "Besides," she whispered, "someone has to patch up the idiots who think they can fight gravity." The air between us shifted, charged. It wasn't the electric buzz of the city. It was the magnetic pull of two people freezing to death, seeking the only warmth left. I wanted to lean into her hand. I wanted to drop the burden of the scribe and just be a man for 5 minutes. But then, the metal door of the safe house groaned open. The wind howled in, cold and cruel. Jinx stumbled inside. He didn't say the code word. He didn't close the door. He just stood there, swaying. He was clutching his ears. "Jinx?" I put the coffee down slowly. The boy looked up. He was 12 years old, but in the flickering light, he looked ancient. His nose was bleeding. A slow, dark trickle. "Kaylin," he whimpered. It's so loud." 25. The frequency of a soul. Rhea moved before I did. She was at the boy's side in a second, kicking the door shut to cut off the draft. "Get him to the mattress," she ordered. We laid Jinx down. He was burning up. His skin felt like paper left in an oven. "Did you get hit?" I asked, frantically checking him for bullet holes. "Jinx, talk to me. Did the guards see you?" "No guards," Jinx gasped. His eyes were darting around the room, seeing things that weren't there. I got too close to the tower, the repeater node. I dropped my jammer." My blood ran cold. The signal jammer. It was a small device Van had designed prototypes of, a simple frequency blocker that kept the hum at bay for the clears. Without it, near a repeater, the signal would boil your brain. "He's suffering from signal resonance," Rhea said, her voice tight with panic. She grabbed a wet rag and pressed it to his forehead. "His neural pathways are trying to sync with the hive, but his conscious mind is fighting it. It's tearing him apart." "Make it stop," Jinx sobbed. He curled into a ball. "Please, it's scratching inside my skull. They're all talking at once. Can't you hear them?" I looked at Rhea. "Do we have any blockers? Any sedatives?" "We used the last of the sedatives on your shoulder," she said. She looked at me and I saw the devastation in her eyes. "There's nothing, Kaylin. We just have to hold him." I knelt beside the boy. This was the kid who had stolen the grapple gun from me. The kid who shared his rat skewers with me when I was starving. He grabbed my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong, desperate. "Tell me a story, scribe," Jinx whispered through chattering teeth. Like the old days, before the silence." My throat felt like it was filled with glass. I squeezed his hand. "Okay, Jinx. Okay." I leaned close to his ear, trying to drown out the invisible noise destroying him. Once there was a city built on a cloud," I lied. My voice shook. "And the people there didn't walk in step. They danced. They danced so hard the rain bounced off the streets." Did they have real coffee?" Jinx asked, his eyes losing focus. The pupils were dilating, pulsing with a faint blue rhythm. "Ocean of it," I promised, tears stinging my eyes. "And the sun shone every day, and no one was ever lonely." Jinx smiled, a weak, crooked thing. "Sounds nice." Then his body went rigid. His back arched off the mattress. He let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a hum, a perfect, mechanical hum in the key of C-sharp. Then he collapsed. He didn't die. That would have been a mercy. Jinx opened his eyes. The fear was gone. The pain was gone. The boy was gone. His eyes were empty, flat, glassy. He sat up slowly. He looked at me. He looked at Rhea. He didn't recognize us. He stood up, his movements smooth, synchronized with a beat only he could hear. Left foot, right foot. "Jinx?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He turned to the door. He had work to do. The signal commanded it. I stood up to stop him, to shake him, to scream at him. Rhea grabbed my arm. She held me back. She was crying, silent tears running through the grease on her cheeks. "He's gone, Kaylin," she choked out. "Let him go. If you keep him here, he'll just break the furniture trying to get to his station." I watched the boy, my friend, walk to the door, open it, and step out into the rain. He joined the rhythm of the city, another cog in the machine. I stood in the open doorway, watching him disappear into the neon fog. The coffee in the mug on the table was still warm, but the room felt colder than the grave. I turned to Ria. The softness was gone from my face. The scribe had finished writing the tragedy. Now, the soldier needed to act. "The Iron Syndicate," I said. My voice was ice. Ria looked up, wiping her face. "What?" "We can't fight this with scavenged scraps and stories," I said, buckling my shock stave back on. "We need an army. I don't care if they are criminals. I don't care if they are murderers. If they have a pulse, I want them." I looked at the empty doorway one last time. "Moorgrave took the boy's mind," I whispered. "So I'm going to take Moorgrave City apart, brick by brick." 26. The Calculus of Blood. I was cleaning the blood off the shock stave when Ria finally spoke. She was sitting on the edge of the mattress where Jinx had lain moments ago. She held the boy's empty mug in her hands, her knuckles white. "Torin will kill you," she said. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold precision of a mechanic diagnosing a broken engine. "Torin is a businessman," I replied, not looking up. I wiped the carbon scoring from the weapon's tip. "He deals in violence. I'm just bringing him a new contract." "He deals in bones, Kaylin." Ria stood up, the mug hitting the floor with a dull thud. She walked over to me, grabbing the stave from my hands. "You're a historian. You know what the Syndicate did during the Purge. When the gas fell, they didn't help people. They went door to door in Sector 4 and broke the legs of anyone who owned more than 2 blankets." "I know," I said, meeting her gray eyes. "They are animals. And you want to walk into their den, into the rust pit, alone?" "I don't have a choice, Ria," I snapped, the anger finally cracking through my calm facade. "Look around. We are hiding in a crawl space. We just lost Jinx because we couldn't jam a signal for 10 minutes. Moorgrave has an army of sleepers. Ilara has a hive mind. What do I have? I have a soldering iron and a dying hope." I took a breath, lowering my voice. "I need chaos. The Syndicate is the only force in this city that hates authority more than they hate pain. They are immune to the hum because they are too angry to listen to it." Ria stared at me. She reached out and touched the bandage on my shoulder. Her touch wasn't gentle this time. It was searching. "It's not just about an army," she whispered. "You think you can use them, but Torin, he remembers. He remembers the night Van humiliated him in the bar. He remembers that you were there." "I'm counting on his memory," I lied. Or maybe I wasn't. He hates Van, but he hates Moorgrave more. Moorgrave's peace put the Syndicate out of business. Extortion doesn't work when the victims don't fear death. Ria stepped closer. The smell of grease and stale coffee on her was the only grounding thing in my world. "They will ask for a price, Kaylin," she said. "The Iron Syndicate doesn't take IOUs. They take flesh. They take loyalty. If you lead them, you become one of them. I am already a murderer, Ria. What's a few more degrees to the right?" She slapped me. It wasn't hard. It was a sting, a wake-up call. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't you dare rewrite yourself into a villain just because it's easier than being a hero who fails. Van wore a mask to hide the truth. You're wearing this hardness, to hide your fear." I stood there, stinging, looking at the woman who had stitched me back together more times than I could count. She saw through me. The scribe could fool the city, but he couldn't fool the mechanic. "I am afraid," I admitted, my voice breaking. I'm terrified that if I don't do this, Jinx is just the first. I'm terrified that Van is screaming in that tower right now, and I'm drinking coffee. Ria's expression softened. The storm in her eyes quieted. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a jagged piece of metal, filed into a crude shiv. "Torin respects strength," she said, pressing the weapon into my hand. "But he despises desperation. If you go there begging, he will feed you to the dogs. If you go there demanding—" She paused, looking at my neck, exposed and vulnerable. "You have to be the monster you're pretending to be, Kaylin. Can you do that?" I closed my fingers around the cold metal of the shiv. "I don't know," I whispered. Ria leaned in. For a second I thought she would kiss me. Instead, she pressed her forehead against mine. A transfer of will. "Come back," she ordered softly. "If you die in the rust pit, I'll never forgive you. And I won't patch you up for the funeral." "I'll come back," I promised. I pulled away, grabbed my coat, and stepped toward the door. "Ria?" "Yeah?" "If I don't, burn the journals. Don't let them read what we tried to do." She didn't answer. She just picked up the shock stave I had dropped and began polishing it, her hands moving with a furious, terrified rhythm. I walked out into the rain. The warmth of the safe house faded instantly, replaced by the chill of the city. I turned my collar up and headed down, toward Sector 4, toward the slaughterhouse. I wasn't the scribe anymore. I was a man looking to make a deal with the devil, hoping I had enough soul left to pay the tab. 27th. The glitch in the rain. I walked alone. It was the only way. Ria had locked the heavy bolt behind me. The sound of that lock clicking shut felt final, like the lid of a coffin. She stayed behind because she was the anchor. I was the line cast out into the storm. If the line snapped, the anchor would remain. If the anchor moved, we were both lost. I kept to the shadows of Sector 5, moving parallel to the main thoroughfare. The hollows, the citizens enslaved by the hum, marched in the center of the street. They were efficient. They didn't look into alleyways. I adjusted the shock stave under my coat. It felt heavy, a cold bar of iron against my spine. In my pocket, I fingered the jagged shiv Ria had given me. It wasn't much against an army, but it was sharp enough to open a throat, or my own wrist, if it came to that. I needed to cross the gray bridge to get to the rust pit. The bridge was crowded. A river of silent people flowing home from the factories. I waited for a gap in the patrols, timing my breath with the rhythm of their feet. Left, right, left, right. Then, I saw her. She was an elderly woman, dressed in the gray rags of a textile worker. She was marching in the third row. Suddenly, she stopped. The hollow behind her bumped into her, but didn't react. He just stood there, waiting for the obstruction to clear, his face blank. The woman wasn't blank. She was shaking. I watched from behind a rusted gargoyle as she raised her hands to her face. She wasn't clawing at her eyes like Jinx had. She was touching her own tears. "Blue," she whispered. It was faint, but in the silence of the city, it was a scream. She looked up at the sky, not with the empty stare of a drone, but with confusion. She looked directly at where I was hiding. For a second, our eyes locked. I saw consciousness. I saw a person fighting their way to the surface of a deep, dark ocean. "The bird," she rasped, pointing a trembling finger at the neon sign of a hawk above us. "It's blue." She smiled, a genuine, human smile. Then, the hum spiked. I heard the low-frequency thrum intensify from the nearest repeater node. The woman's smile vanished instantly. Her spine snapped straight, her hand dropped, the light in her eyes extinguished. Left, Right. Left. Right. She marched on, swallowed by the gray river. I stood there, frozen. Morgrave claimed his control was absolute. He claimed the city was solved. But he was wrong. The human mind was resisting. It was glitching. The woman hadn't broken free because of a jammer or a cure. She had broken free because of a memory. This changed everything. We didn't need to destroy the tower to win. We just needed to remind people who they were. But reminders wouldn't stop the syndicate from killing me. I pulled my collar up and moved toward the industrial sector. The hope I felt was dangerous. Hope makes you careless, and I was walking into a place where carelessness was a capital offense. 28. The Factory of Bad Dreams. I didn't walk into the rust pit like a king. I crawled into it like a rat. The perimeter was tighter than I expected. The syndicate hadn't just piled up junk. They had built a fortress of paranoia. I managed to bypass the outer sentries by wading through a toxic drainage canal that smelled of sulfur and dead fish. But inside was a revelation. I expected a hideout. What I found was a refinery. From the shadows of a suspended catwalk, I looked down into the cavern. It wasn't filled with rebels planning a revolution. It was filled with vats. Massive, rusted tanks bubbling with a neon blue sludge. Men and women with the iron armband moved with frantic energy, skimming the froth from the vats and packing it into crates marked with the Ashen Guild cogwheel. The realization hit me harder than a bullet. They weren't fighting Morgrave. They were feeding him. Pure glimmer extract, I whispered to myself, wiping slime from my face. Morgrave controls the distribution, but the syndicate controls the brew. This changed everything. An alliance wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. Why would Torin bite the hand that signed his paychecks? I tried to back away, to retreat and rethink, but I was distracted. Below me, a worker stumbled. He dropped a crate. Glass shattered. A syndicate enforcer, a massive brute with a cybernetic jaw, didn't yell. He simply walked over, picked up the worker by the neck, and threw him toward the vats. The man screamed as the acid fumes hit him. It reminded me of the matriarch. Vespera threw people from heights. The syndicate threw them into chemicals. Different methods, same disregard for life. I thought of Van. You broke the world to save it, my friend. But the pieces just rearranged themselves into a new prison. I was so busy watching the cruelty that I didn't hear the bootstep behind me. Click. The sound of a hammer cocking on a heavy revolver. Lost, little bird. A voice rasped. I spun around. 3 of them. Wearing filtration masks and heavy leather aprons stained with blue residue. They didn't look like warriors. They looked like butchers. I didn't reach for the shock stave. Against 3 guns at point-blank range, it was a suicide stick. I'm looking for Torin, I said, raising my hands. I have a business proposition. The leader laughed. It was a wet, hacking sound inside his mask. Torin doesn't take meetings with trespassers. He takes inventory. He swung the butt of his rifle. I saw it coming, but I was too slow. The wood connected with my temple. A flash of white light. Then the rusty floor rushed up to meet me. My last thought before the darkness took me was of the old woman in the rain. The glitch. The only pure thing left in a city of poison. 29. The King of Scraps. Checked his pockets. Nothing but a journal and a broken knife. He's nobody, boss. Everyone is somebody until you peel them. I woke up screaming, but no sound came out. My throat was dry as ash. I was tied to a chair. A heavy iron chair bolted to the floor. My head throbbed in time with the distant pounding of the refinery pumps. I was in a different room. An office overlooking the factory floor. The walls were lined with shelves displaying gruesome trophies. Helmets of dead council guards, pieces of destroyed guild machinery, and jars of rare chemicals. And there, behind a desk made from the cowl of a turbine engine, sat Torin. He was more terrifying than my memory served. The burn scars on his face had healed into tight, shiny ridges that pulled his lip into a permanent sneer. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing a silk vest that was too small for him, finery stolen from a dead noble, stained with engine oil. He was counting money, not digital credits, coins, old council minted gold. "You're awake," Torin said, not looking up. He stacked a pile of coins with surprising delicacy. "My boys say you were sneaking around the catwalks, spying on my cook." "Not spying," I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel. "Assessing." Torin paused. He looked up. His eyes were yellowed, bloodshot. The eyes of a man who hasn't slept in a decade. "And what is your assessment, scribe?" He recognized me, or at least, he recognized the type. "That you are a slave," I said. The room went dead silent. The two guards by the door tensed, hands drifting to their machetes. Torin didn't get angry. He smiled. It was a horrific sight. "A slave?" He stood up and walked around the desk. He dragged a metal pipe along the floor, the screeching sound tearing at my nerves. "Moorgrave pays me 5,000 credits a week to keep the glimmer flowing. I eat real meat. I have power." "You have permission," I corrected, adrenaline clearing the fog in my brain. "Moorgrave lets you exist because you do the dirty work. You breathe the fumes so he can sit in his white tower. But we both know the truth, Torin." I leaned forward as far as the ropes allowed. "The demand for glimmer is dropping." Torin stopped. The pipe hovered inches from my knee. "What did you say?" "The hum," I said, fast, desperate. "Moorgrave's signal turns people into hollows. Hollows don't get high. They don't buy drugs. They just work. Moorgrave is shrinking your market, Torin. Eventually, he won't need the glimmer at all. He'll just need the signal. And when that day comes, what happens to the syndicate?" I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. It was a small crack, but it was there. I had to pry it open. "I saw Van break the matriarch," I whispered. "I saw the power of chaos. You thrived in that chaos, Torin. You were a king in the Anarchy. Now, you're just a janitor in Moorgrave's museum." Torin slammed the pipe onto the table next to me. Clang! He leaned in close. He smelled of ozone and old blood. "Van is dead," Torin hissed. "Or worse. And you are a ghost looking for a grave. Why shouldn't I sell you to the guild right now? Moorgrave has a bounty on the scribe." "Because I found a flaw," I said. I held his gaze. "I saw a hollow wake up today. Without the jammer. Without the antidote." Torin frowned. "Bullshit. Once the hum takes them, they're gone." "No," I said. "The signal isn't perfect. It's glitching. And if it's glitching, it can be broken. I don't want to destroy the city, Torin. I want to give you back your customers." It was a cynical, dark argument. I wasn't appealing to his morality. I was appealing to his greed. I was offering to bring back the chaos so he could sell drugs again. It made me sick. But it was the only language he spoke. Torin stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. Then, he turned to his guards. "Leave us." The guards hesitated, then left. Torin cut my ropes with a single swipe of a knife I hadn't seen him draw. "You have 5 minutes, scribe," Torin growled, sitting back on the edge of his desk. "Tell me about this glitch, and if I think you're lying, I'll put you in the vat myself." 30. The Architect of Zero. Torin didn't answer my challenge immediately. Instead, he walked over to the heavy iron shutters that overlooked the polluted canal outside. He cranked a wheel, and the shutters groaned open. "You talk about glitches," Torin said, his voice unusually quiet. "You talk about breaking the signal, but you forget who built the transmitter. He pointed out the window. Far in the distance, rising from the center of the throat like a needle piercing the sky, stood the white spire. It was the headquarters of the Ashen Guild. While the rest of the city was drowning in soot and rain, the spire was pristine. Illuminated by floodlights, it glowed with a terrifying, sterile purity. "Moorgrave," I whispered. "He doesn't sleep," Torrens said. "My spies tell me he replaced half his brain with a processor just so he could micromanage the city's economy in real time. He knows the price of grain in Sector 1 and the oxygen levels in Sector 9 simultaneously." Torren turned back to me. The bravado was gone from his face. Under the scars, I saw the terror of a man who knows he is obsolete. "He buys my glimmer, yes, but last week he cut the order by 10%. The week before, 15%. Because the Hollows don't need drugs," I concluded. "Exactly. But it's not just business, Scribe. It's ideology." Torren walked to a heavy blast door in the corner of his office. He punched in a code. The door hissed open. Inside was a cell, but it wasn't a prison cell. It was a display case. Sitting on a stool, staring blankly at the wall, was a massive man. He wore the tattered remains of a syndicate lieutenant's uniform. "This is Brix," Torren said softly. "My brother. He was the strongest fighter in the rust pit." He laughed at the hum. He said he was immune. Torren snapped his fingers in front of Brix's face. Brix didn't blink. He didn't breathe faster. He just sat there, a statue of flesh. "Moorgrave invited him for a meeting last month," Torren said. Brix went in shouting threats. He came back, like this. No marks on him. No torture, just empty. Torren grabbed his brother's chin and forced him to look at me. Brix's eyes were terrifyingly clear. There was no cloudiness, no madness, just absolute, serene nothingness. "Moorgrave calls it the 0 point," Torren whispered. "He doesn't want slaves, Kalen. Slaves rebel. He wants components. He wants a city where crime is impossible because passion is impossible, where hunger is just a notification to be swiped away." Suddenly, the lights in the office flickered. The speakers mounted on the walls crackled to life. It was time for the daily address. "Citizens of Cenote." The voice was smooth, cultured, and perfectly modulated. It was Moorgrave. I looked at the screen embedded in the wall. Moorgrave's face appeared. He looked ageless, his silver eyes shimmering. He sat in his white tower, holding a glass of water. "Today marks the 100th day without a murder in the upper districts," Moorgrave said, smiling gently. "The noise of the past is fading. The chaotic screams of your ancestors, the anger, the greed, the fear, are being replaced by the hum. Do you feel it?" In the cell, Brix's head tilted slightly, a receiver acknowledging the broadcast. "Some still cling to the old ways," Moorgrave continued, and for a second, it felt like his silver eyes were looking directly through the screen, right at me. "Some call it freedom, but look at their freedom. It is dirt. It is starvation. It is pain. I offer you the end of history. I offer you the silence of a perfect machine." The screen went black. Torren let go of his brother's face. He looked at me, shaking. "He wants to expand the signal," Torren said. "Rumor is, Van is helping him build a grand amplifier. If that turns on, it won't just be the people with glimmer in their blood. It will be everyone, even you, even me." That is his goal, I realized, the full horror sinking in. He doesn't want to rule the world. He wants to solve it. He views humanity as a broken equation. This was the dilemma. Moorgrave wasn't a tyrant hoarding gold. He was a fanatic hoarding order. He genuinely believed that turning Brix into a vegetable was an act of mercy. "If we fight him," Torren said, sitting heavily in his chair, "we don't just fight an army. We fight that. He pointed at his brother. We fight the inevitable. No, I said, stepping forward. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the desk. Morgrave makes a mistake common to all perfectionists, Torin. He assumes the machine will never break. But I saw the break. I saw the glitch. I looked at the mindless hulk of bricks. What if I told you that inside that empty shell, your brother is screaming? Torin's head snapped up. What? The glitch I saw. The woman. She wasn't empty. She was trapped. The signal suppresses the conscious mind, but it doesn't erase it. Bricks is still in there, Torin. He's locked in a room with no doors, listening to Morgrave's voice 24/7. I saw the rage ignite in Torin's eyes. It wasn't greed anymore. It was pure, fraternal hatred. You're saying he's suffering? Torin asked, his voice trembling. I'm saying he's waiting, I lied. Or maybe it was the truth. Waiting for us to cut the power. Torin stood up. He walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a heavy, rusted shotgun. He cracked it open and checked the shells. The Syndicate has 3,000 men, Torin growled. Half of them are high on glimmer, liable to turn on us if the signal spikes. The other half are scared shitless. He snapped the shotgun closed. But if there's a chance, even a 1% chance, that I can get my brother back? He turned to me. You have your army, scribe. Now tell me how we kill a god. 31. The Architecture of Boredom. The waiting was not heroic. It was just damp. I sat on a crate of rusted bolts in a corner of the Syndicate's refinery, watching a leak in the ceiling. A single drop of oily water fell every 4 seconds. Plip, plip, plip. It hit a puddle on the concrete floor, sending tiny, concentric ripples out toward my boots. I tried to write in my journal, but the ink felt sluggish in the cold. My fingers were stiff, stained with soot that no amount of scrubbing could remove. I looked at my hand. It didn't look like my hand anymore. It looked like a tool, an object shaped by the violence it had been forced to commit. I thought about Van. Not the legend, not the jester in the purple coat screaming from the rooftops, but the man. I remembered a morning years ago, before the fall. We were eating stale bread on a fire escape. Van had laughed at a stray cat chasing a moth. He had crumbs in his beard. He looked so painfully ordinary then. Now he was a ghost in a machine, and I was sitting in a factory that smelled of sulfur and unwashed bodies, waiting for a man named Torin to decide if we were going to live or die. Rhea slept on a pile of canvas sacks nearby. Even in sleep, her forehead was creased. She lay curled up, defensive, like a fossil waiting to be excavated. I watched the rise and fall of her chest. It was the only rhythm in this place that didn't sound industrial. It was soft, mortal. I felt a sudden crushing wave of shame. Not for the war, but for the fact that I had dragged her into this ugliness. She belonged in a workshop with sunlight, fixing toasters or music boxes, not rigging explosives to kill strangers. I looked back at the water drop. Plip. This is what history books leave out, I thought. They write about the battles and the speeches. They don't write about the hours you spend staring at a puddle, realizing that your socks are wet and that you might never be dry again. They don't write about the boredom of the apocalypse. Torin walked by. He didn't look at me. He was shouting at a subordinate about fuel rations. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of lack of sleep, but the tiredness of a soul that has been carrying too much weight for too long. He was a monster, yes, but looking at the slump of his shoulders, I realized he was also just a man who was afraid of the dark. I closed my journal. The sound was sharp in the humid air. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man waiting for the rain to stop. 32. The Taste of Blue Tobacco. Later that night, the noise of the refinery died down to a low hum. The workers, the ones who weren't hollowed out by glimmer, had collapsed into their bunks. I went out to the loading dock to smoke. I didn't have cigarettes. I had a pinch of blue tobacco, a dried fungus from the sump that Torrens men chewed. I rolled it in a scrap of paper torn from an old shipping manifest. The door creaked behind me. Rhea stepped out into the smog. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The air outside was thick, tasting of copper and ozone. "You shouldn't smoke that," she said quietly. "It rots your teeth." "My teeth are the least of my worries," I said, lighting the roll with a match. The flame flared briefly, illuminating the hollows of her face. She looked beautiful in a way that hurt. Not glamorous, but real. Like a statue that had weathered a storm. She came and stood next to me, leaning on the railing. We looked out over the canal. The water was black, reflecting the distant, sterile white glow of Moorgrave's spire. "Do you remember oranges?" she asked suddenly. I looked at her. "What?" "Oranges," she repeated. "My grandmother used to buy them, from the surface traders before the blockade. I remember peeling them. The smell. It stayed on your fingers for hours. It was so bright. Sharp." She closed her eyes, inhaling the smog as if trying to filter it into memory. "I haven't smelled anything sharp in 6 months, Kaylin. Everything here smells like gray." I took a drag of the blue tobacco. It tasted like earth and musk. "I remember paper," I said. "New parchment. Crisp. Dry. The sound it makes when you turn a page." "We sound like old people," she laughed softly. It was a rusty sound, unused. "We are old, Rhea. The city ages you in dog years." She turned to me. She reached out and took the cigarette from my lips. She took a drag, wincing at the harshness, then exhaled a plume of blue smoke. "I don't think we're going to win," she said. She didn't say it with despair. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. "I know," I admitted. It was the first time I had said it aloud. The lie I told the syndicate, that we had a plan, that we had a chance, dissolved in the intimacy of the moment. Moorgrave is an equation. We are just rounding errors. So why are we doing it? I looked at her. I looked at the grease smudge on her cheek, the fraying collar of her jacket, the way her hands trembled slightly from the cold. "Because of the orange," I said. She frowned. "What?" "If we let him win, if we let the signal take everyone, no one will remember the orange. No one will remember the smell of it, or the sound of paper, or the way you look right now, standing in the fog." I stepped closer. The space between us felt charged, heavy with all the things we hadn't said. "I fight," I whispered, "because memory is the only proof that we were here. If we become hollows, the history is erased. I'm the scribe. I can't let the page go blank." Rhea looked at me for a long time. The wind blew her hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. "You're an idiot," she whispered, but she leaned into me. Her head rested on my shoulder, heavy and warm. We stood there for a long time, watching the white spire pulsate in the distance. We didn't kiss. We didn't make grand promises. We just shared the warmth of a dying cigarette and the terrified comfort of not being alone at the end of the world. It was a small moment, insignificant to the war. But as I felt her breath against my neck, I realized it was the only victory that mattered. 33. The hollow in the mirror. I had to wait inside the apartment for 3 hours before the family went to sleep. I was huddled inside a maintenance closet in the hallway of a residential block in Sector 2. Through the louvers of the door, I watched them eat dinner. It was a man, a woman, and a young girl, maybe 7 years old. The apartment was clean in a way that felt aggressive. The floorboards shone with a chemical polish that smelled of lemons and formaldehyde. There were no pictures on the walls, only the standard issue landscape prints provided by the guild. A geometric mountain, a perfectly circular sun. They sat around a small, circular table. They ate stew. I watched the father. He lifted his spoon. He put it in his mouth. He chewed 12 times. He swallowed. He lowered the spoon. 2 seconds later, the mother did the exact same thing. Then the child. It wasn't robotic in the sense of jerky movements. It was fluid, graceful even. But it was the synchronization that made my skin crawl. It was the complete absence of friction. I remembered dinners at the orphanage, the chaos, the fighting over the last crust of bread, the boy named Tomas who would always spill his water just to hear the splash, the matron screaming. It was miserable, yes, but it was alive. Here there were no spills. There were no elbows on the table. There was no pass the salt. There was only the signal, conducting their hunger like a metronome. I shifted my weight in the cramped closet. My knee popped. A loud, dry crack. In a normal world, heads would turn. A father would stand up shouting, "Who's there?" A mother would grab her child. Here? Nothing. The spoon hit the bowl. Click. The mouth opened. The stew vanished. They didn't hear me because the signal hadn't told them to listen for intruders. I was a variable outside their programming. To them, I didn't exist. I felt a profound, overwhelming loneliness. It wasn't the loneliness of being isolated. It was the loneliness of being the only specific thing in a universe of generalizations. I looked at the little girl. She had a ribbon in her hair. It was red. It was slightly crooked. For a moment I wondered, does she know it's crooked? Does she care? Is there a tiny part of her screaming inside that skull, begging to reach up and fix it? Or is the screaming gone, replaced by a warm, fuzzy hum? I looked at my own hands, dirty, trembling, a fingernail bitten down to the quick, bleeding slightly. I realized then that Morgrave hadn't just stolen their freedom. He had stolen their ugliness. He had stolen the beautiful, messy, jagged edges that make a person fit into the world in their own unique way. They finished eating. They stood up in unison. They walked to the bedrooms. When the lights finally went out, I stepped out of the closet. My legs were numb. The air in the apartment was stale, recycled. I walked to the living room wall. I wasn't here to liberate them. I was here to steal a phase coupler from their wall screen, a component Rhea needed for the hack. I pried the panel open with my knife. It came loose with a snap. I pulled out the chip. Before I left, I walked past the girl's bedroom. The door was open. She was sleeping on her back, hands folded over her chest. I walked in. I couldn't help myself. I reached out and touched the red ribbon in her hair. I untied it. I placed it on her pillow, next to her head. A small act of disorder. A question mark left in a sentence that ended with a period. I left the apartment. As I walked back out into the rain, I felt heavier. I had the component, but I had left something behind in that room. My envy. Because for a terrifying second, watching them sleep without dreams or nightmares, I had wanted to be one of them. 34. The box of heavy things. When I returned to the rust pit, there was a stranger waiting for me. He wasn't from the syndicate. He was a dredger, one of the outcasts who lived in the buffer zone between the sump and the sewers. He was blind, his eyes covered by a rag, relying on the vibrations of the floor to navigate. He sat at Torin's table, drinking water with shaking hands. "He says he has a delivery," Torin grunted, leaning against a pillar, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "Says it's for the scribe, won't give it to anyone else." I walked over to the man. He smelled of wet mushrooms and old copper. "I am the scribe," I said. The dredger tilted his head. "You smell like ink," he rasped, "and blood." He reached into his rags and pulled out a small wooden box. It was made of dark mahogany, polished smooth by years of handling. It looked expensive, out of place. "Found it in the drift," the dredger said. "Near the chrysalis. The fungal guards. They let me pass. They wanted me to find it." He pushed the box across the table. "They said, 'Tell the scribe that history has missing pages.'" I stared at the box. It wasn't trapped. It didn't look dangerous. It looked personal. I opened the latch. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had rotted with age, was an audio log, a cassette tape, and a photograph. I picked up the photograph first. It was a physical print, sepia-toned, cracked at the corners. It showed a young woman sitting on a park bench. She was laughing, her head thrown back. It was Alara. But she looked different, younger, softer. No glowing veins, no sadness. And next to her, holding her hand, was Van. He wasn't wearing the jester's paint. He wore a simple shirt. He looked happy. But it was what sat on Alara's lap that stopped my heart. A baby, wrapped in a blanket, holding Van's thumb. "A child," I whispered. The air left the room. Ria, who had been working on the jammer in the corner, walked over. She looked at the photo over my shoulder. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "Van never said." "He never said anything," I muttered. I picked up the tape. I inserted it into the old player Torin kept on his desk. I pressed play. Hiss. Click. Van's voice filled the cavern. But it wasn't the manic voice of the jester. It was the tired, desperate voice of a man making a confession. Day 402. Vespera knows. She knows about the girl. She threatened to take her to the spire, to educate her. A pause. The sound of a glass clinking. "I can't let them have her, Alara. I won't let them turn her into one of those dolls in the White Tower. I have to do it. The gas, the anarchy. It's the only way to hide her. If I burn the records, if I burn the whole city, maybe they'll lose her in the smoke." The tape ended with a sharp click. I sat there staring at the cassette. The narrative collapsed. The legend of the jester, the anarchist who wanted to break the system because the system was corrupt, was a lie. Or at least, a half-truth. He didn't break the city for ideology. He broke it to create a smokescreen. He destroyed civilization to hide one child from the council. "The child?" Ria asked, her voice trembling. "Where is she?" "Morgrave has her," I realized, looking at Torin. "That's why Van is in the machine. That's why he gave up. Morgrave didn't just capture Van. He found the daughter." I looked at the photograph again. The baby's eyes. They were gray, like slate. A cold shiver went down my spine. I turned slowly to look at Ria. She was staring at the photo. Her face was pale. Her hand was covering her mouth. "Ria?" I asked. She backed away. "No," she whispered. "My parents, they died in the riots. I grew up in Sector 5. "Did they?" I asked, standing up. "Or is that just what the orphanage told you?" The silence in the rust pit was absolute. The dripping water sounded like thunder. Van wasn't just my friend. He was Ria's father. And the woman I was falling in love with was the reason the world had ended. 35. The Chemist's Ledger. The revelation about Ria hung in the air like smoke, but Torin didn't give us time to process the grief. He walked to a heavy painting on the wall of his office, a portrait of a burning factory, and pulled it aside. Behind it was a safe. "You think Van was a saint," Torin said, spinning the dial. "You think he broke the city because he was a poet." He opened the safe. Inside wasn't gold. It was blue notebooks, dozens of them. Torin tossed one onto the table. It slid across the rusted metal and stopped in front of me. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Van's. But it wasn't the philosophical ramblings of the jester. It was pure, cold chemistry. Formula 41, Torin muttered. Glimmer, the original recipe. I opened the book. The pages were stained with chemical burns. Subject: Income generation for Project Silence. Entry 44. The synthesis is stable. The euphoric effect is high. Addiction rate is 98%. Estimated weekly revenue, sufficient to purchase the ventilation components needed for the gas. My stomach churned. He created it, I whispered. He created the drug that turned half the city into addicts. He needed money, scribe, Torin said, pouring himself a drink of harsh, clear alcohol. Revolutions aren't free. Vespera controlled the banks. Van needed a black economy. He came to me when I was just a street thug. He taught me how to cook. He made me the king of the rust pit so he could be the savior of the throat. I looked at Rhea. She was staring at the notebook, her face pale. She was learning that her father wasn't just a tragic hero. He was a drug lord who had poisoned thousands to save a few. We were partners, Torin continued, taking a swig. He provided the science, I provided the distribution. We justified it. We said we were sedating the pain of the matriarch's rule. We called it medicine. He laughed bitterly. But then he fell, and Morgrave took over. Morgrave realized that Glimmer wasn't just a drug, it was a conduit, a way to inject microscopic fungal spores into the bloodstream of the population. Van didn't just build a drug empire, Kalen. He laid the fiber optic cables for Morgrave's mind control. I closed the book. The complexity of the betrayal was suffocating. Van had built the cage he was now trapped in. Why are you showing us this? I asked. Because the recipe changed, Torin said, leaning forward. Morgrave altered the formula 6 months ago. He made it stronger, more conductive, but less stable. My cooks, they can't replicate the new batch. It keeps turning into acid. We're losing product. We're losing money. He pointed a scarred finger at Rhea. If she is his daughter, if she has his blood, maybe she has his talent, or maybe she has the biological key. Rhea stepped back. I'm a mechanic. I fix engines, not chemicals. Engines run on fuel, Torin growled. Bodies run on blood. You're going to the lab, girl. You're going to fix the batch, or I hand you over to the guild as a lost asset. The alliance had shifted again. We weren't partners. We were employees. 36. The blood in the vat. They separated us. Torin's men dragged me to a holding pen overlooking the factory floor, while they took Rhea down to the mixing vats. I gripped the bars of the cage, watching helplessly. This was the nightmare Van had built, and now his daughter was being forced to run it. Rhea stood before a massive vat of unstable, bubbling sludge. It was a violent, angry neon blue. "Fix it!" the lead cook shouted, shoving a testing kit into her hands. Rhea looked terrified. She fumbled with the pipettes. She didn't know the chemistry. She didn't know the formulas. But as she reached out to take a sample, she cut her hand on a jagged edge of the rusted vat. A single drop of her blood fell into the sludge. Hiss! The reaction was immediate. The angry, bubbling boil stopped instantly. The sludge turned from a sickly neon to a deep, calm, crystalline cobalt. The fumes vanished. The liquid became perfectly clear, like water. The entire factory floor went silent. The workers stared. "It's stabilized," the cook whispered, checking the gauges. "Purity levels, 100%. Toxicity, 0%. I watched from above, and the pieces finally clicked into place. Rhea wasn't just Van's daughter. She was the child of a woman who had merged with the mycelial network. Her blood contained antibodies, or perhaps symbiotic spores, that neutralized the chaotic elements of the fungus. She was the universal donor, If Morgrave got her, he wouldn't just use her to stabilize the drug. He would use her to stabilize the signal. With her blood, he could amplify the hum to global levels without burning out the receivers. He could turn the entire world into perfectly preserved, living statues. Rhea stared at the vat, holding her bleeding hand. She realized it too. She looked up at me in the cage. Her eyes were wide with a new kind of horror. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was the most valuable resource in Cenote. Torin walked up to the vat. He dipped a finger in the now perfect glimmer and tasted it. He smiled. A greedy, terrifying smile. "Well," Torin said, looking at Rhea like she was a pile of diamonds, "it seems we don't need Van anymore." Suddenly the factory alarms blared. A rhythmic, piercing siren. Whoop, whoop, whoop. "Guild raid!" a sentry screamed from the catwalk. The blast doors exploded inward. It wasn't a stealth team this time. It was a heavy breacher squad. Massive, steam-powered mechs tore through the barricades. But they weren't shooting to kill. "Target identified," a synthesized voice boomed from the lead mech. "Subject, Rhea. Priority, Alpha. Capture intact." Morgrave hadn't found us by luck. The moment Rhea's blood hit the vat, the network felt it. The mycelium in the vats had sent a signal straight to the White Spire. Torin drew his gun. "She's mine!" he roared, firing uselessly at the mechs. "Kaelin!" Rhea screamed, looking up at me. I threw myself against the cage door. The lock held. I watched as the chaos unfolded. The Syndicate fought for their profits. The Guild fought for their god. And in the middle of it all, Rhea stood alone, clutching her bleeding hand. The holy grail of a poisoned world. 37. The silence of sold things. There is a specific kind of silence that falls when a soul is sold. It is not the quiet of an empty room, nor the hush of a library. It is heavy. It presses against the eardrums like deep water. It is the sound of a story snapping its own spine. I stood in the cage, gripping the cold iron, and I felt that silence wash over the factory floor. Torin held the beaker of clear liquid. He didn't look like a warlord anymore. He looked small. He looked like a man trying to balance a ledger that could never be balanced. "Beautiful," he whispered. I didn't need a formula to understand what was happening. I could feel the current shifting. Until that moment, the story of the Syndicate had been a tragedy, a tale of defiance against impossible odds. But as Torin looked at that clear blue liquid, he rewrote the genre. He turned a tragedy into a transaction. "Torin," I said. My voice felt thin, like paper held over a flame. "Don't." He didn't look up. He was already rehearsing his new role. The wealthy exile, the man in the high tower. He was shedding his loyalty like a snake sheds dead skin. "Get the radio," Torin ordered his men. "Call the Spire." I looked at Rhea. She stood by the vat, her hands stained with the grease of the machine and the blood of her own palm. She caught my eye. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply let her shoulders drop. In that gesture, I read a terrifying truth. She understood the weight of the moment better than I did. She knew that some stories have too much momentum to be stopped by words. She was the anchor, and Torin was cutting the chain. The Guild arrived not with fire, but with a terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. The roof opened. The light descended. It was blinding, sterile white, the color of a blank page where nothing is allowed to be written. I watched as they took her. They placed a collar around her neck. It hummed with a low, dissonant chord that made my teeth ache. Rhea looked back at me one last time. She didn't mouth, "Help me." She mouthed, "Wait." Then she was gone, lifted into the light. Torin stood alone in the rain, holding his beaker, waiting for a reward that would never come. He didn't realize that in Morgrave's story, characters like him aren't partners. They are props. I sat down on the rusted floor of my cage. The rain began to fall through the open roof, washing away the grime, but not the shame. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the airship engines fading. It sounded like the end of the world, or perhaps just the end of the first draft. 38. The weight of a name. To descend into the sump is to walk backwards through time. I left the ruins of the factory behind and went down into the dark. The air grew thick, tasting of copper and fermentation. It was a smell I knew well. The smell of old books rotting in a cellar. The smell of memories decomposing. I carried nothing but my journal and the mahogany box. Yet, my arms ached. The box contained a photograph, a simple image of a man, a woman, and a child. But to a scribe, an image is never just ink on paper. It is a crystallized moment of truth. And truth, in a city built on lies, is the heaviest thing a man can carry. I walked until the stone turned to mud, and the mud turned to living root. The chrysalis loomed ahead. It was not a building, it was a heartbeat. A massive, throbbing knot of biology wrapped around the geothermal vent. The guardians emerged from the fog, the mycelial knights, dead men encased in amber resin, beautiful and terrible. They blocked my path. They did not speak, but I felt their intent. It was a wall of cold pressure, a psychic no that vibrated in my sternum. "The mother sleeps," the ground whispered. "She dreams of silence." I didn't draw a weapon. You cannot cut a dream with a knife. You have to wake the dreamer. "I am Kalen," I said, my voice echoing in the damp cavern. "And I have brought the missing verse." I opened the box. I took out the photograph. I didn't hold it up like evidence. I held it like a lantern. "Her name is not the mother," I whispered to the darkness. "Her name is Alara, and she is not dreaming. She is hiding." The pressure in the air shifted. The knights hesitated. My words were cutting through the narrative they had been fed for years. I stepped forward. "Van lied to you, not out of malice but out of fear. He told you the child was lost in the smoke. He wrote a tragedy to cover up a heist." I placed the photo on a flat stone. "Look." The reaction was not violent. It was heartbreaking. The chrysalis shuddered. The glowing blue veins in the walls pulsed, then turned a deep, bruised purple. A sound tore through the cavern, not a scream, but a gasp. The sound of a lung filling with air after drowning for a decade. The membrane of the chrysalis tore open. Alara hung in the center, suspended by webs of light. She looked less like a goddess and more like a wound that refused to heal. "Rhea." The word didn't come from her mouth. It bloomed in my mind, smelling of oranges and rain. "Morgrave has her," I said softly. "He has taken the story you thought was finished, and he is writing a new ending. A cruel one." Alara opened her eyes. They were endless, filled with the crushing weight of the earth. "Then we must break his pen," she sent. The roots around me began to move. They didn't writhe, they uncoiled. The stillness of the sump broke. The inertia of grief transformed, in a single heartbeat, into the kinetic energy of rage. 39. The ink of the earth. We did not march on the White Spire. We grew over it. I have read histories of great sieges. They speak of battering rams, of catapults, of starving out the enemy. But nature does not besiege. Nature reclaims. We ascended through the ventilation shafts. The spores traveled ahead of us like a golden mist. I watched the city transform. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Rigid lines of steel softened into curves of green moss. Concrete, the symbol of Morgrave's permanence, crumbled into sand under the enzymatic touch of the mycelium. The city wasn't being destroyed. It was being translated, from the language of the machine to the language of the forest. I walked alongside the dead knights. They moved with a fluid grace now, no longer puppets, but extensions of Alara's will. We reached the plaza of the throat. The white spire stood before us. It was a needle of perfection, gleaming with a Teflon sheen that rejected the spores. It stood outside of our story, arrogant and untouchable. Morgrave sent his drones, swarms of them, buzzing like angry flies. They spat fire. I saw a patch of moss catch flame. It burned with a sound like a scream. Ilara flinched in my mind. They heard us. Pain is information, I told her, though my own heart hammered against my ribs. Don't just feel it. Use it. I looked at the spire. I looked at the way it sat on the earth, heavy and imposing. I felt the structure of the moment. Morgrave relied on the foundation being solid. The water, I said. He draws water from the deep to cool his mind. Drink it, Ilara. Drink it all. The roots dived. The ground shook as the water table was drained. The fountains in the plaza ran dry. The cooling vents on the spire stopped venting steam and began to cough black smoke. We reached the front doors, massive slabs of blast-proof glass. I placed my hand on the surface. It vibrated with the frantic energy of the machines inside. Open, I whispered. I didn't use force. I used the certainty of a narrator who knows the chapter is ending. I looked at the glass and refused to acknowledge its strength. The glass didn't shatter. It simply gave up. It turned to dust, blowing away in the wind. We stepped into the lobby. It was cold inside. The air smelled of ozone and panic. The elevator numbers counted down. 10, 9, 8. He's coming, I said. The doors opened, and my heart stopped. 40. The algorithm of flesh. Morgrave didn't come down. He sent his firewall. When the doors opened, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who had been edited. Van stood there. He wore the tatters of his purple velvet coat, but it was woven into an exoskeleton frame of white porcelain and chrome. His skin was gray, translucent, stretched tight over metallic implants. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They were no longer green. They were lenses. They zoomed in and out with tiny, mechanical. "Threat identified," Van said. The voice was his, but the intonation was flat, like a weather report. "Entropy level, critical. Initiating sterilization protocol." Ilara didn't scream. She attacked with the silence of an earthquake. The lobby floor exploded. 3 massive roots, thick as oak trees, shot up and lashed out at the elevator. The magnitude of the strike was enough to crush a tank. Van didn't move. He simply raised his hand. Hum. A wall of blue light, a force field powered by the city's main reactor, materialized. The roots hit the field and evaporated instantly into ash. Van stepped out of the elevator. He walked calmly. Every step cracked the tiles on the floor. He pointed his arm at Ilara. The skin on his forearm split open, revealing a coil. "Deviation," he said. A beam of concentrated heat struck Ilara's manifestation of fungus and light. She shrieked, a sound that cracked the glass in the windows. Parts of her body withered, blackened, and fell off. I pressed myself against a pillar, gripping my pen so hard it snapped. I analyzed the battle through the lens of semantical physics. This wasn't a fight. It was an equation being balanced. Ilara added energy. Van subtracted it. The result was 0. Morgrave's system was designed to absorb infinite amounts of chaos. As long as Van believed in the system, he was invincible. He had a narrative stability of several mega-Harari. I looked at his shoes. Amidst all the high-tech armor, he was still wearing his old, worn leather boots. They were dirty. A patch was sewn on the side with rough thread. A glitch, I thought, an anomaly in the design. Van wasn't 100% machine. He had kept the boots. Why? Because they were comfortable? No. Because he was wearing them the day he met Ilara. I opened my journal. I found the page with the formula for Glimmer. I found the photograph of the baby. Ilara can't win this, I whispered to myself. She's trying to overwhelm him with force, but you can't drown a fish. You have to pull it onto land. I stood up. I stepped out from cover, into the crossfire. 41. The Paradox Vector. "Van!" I shouted. He turned his head. The lenses clicked. A red laser dot landed on my chest. "Scribe," Van said. "You are irrelevant. Remove yourself or be deleted." He raised his arm again. The coil began to charge. I could smell ozone. I had about 3 seconds before I became dust. "You have a logic error in your programming," I said calmly. I held up the photograph of Rhea as a baby. Van stopped. The coil whined, but he didn't fire. His system tried to categorize the object. Object, paper, threat, 0. But Van's brain, the wet biological part that Morgrave couldn't replace, saw something else. "Invalid data," Van said. His voice trembled, a human tremble. "You protect the spire to save her," I said, taking a step closer. The laser burned in my eyes. "You sacrificed the city. You sacrificed Ilara. You sacrificed yourself. All to keep Rhea safe from Morgrave." I pointed upwards, toward the top of the tower. "But she is here, Van. Morgrave has her. He has connected her to the machine. She is bleeding for him right now." Van jerked. It was a physical spasm, as if he had been shocked. "Lie!" he roared. It wasn't the machine voice. It was the jester. "She is hidden. I hid her in the smoke." Ilara, lying injured on the floor, stood up. She understood what I was doing. I was changing the vector. I was altering the intention in the room. "He is not lying, my love," Ilara whispered. Her roots stopped attacking. They began to reach for him, softly, like fingers. "I can feel her. She is 80 floors above us. She is scared, and she is calling for her father." Van grabbed his head. The metal plates scraped against his skull. "System error," he muttered. "Cognitive dissonance detected. Initiating reboot." "You can't reboot," I shouted. "This isn't an error. This is the truth. You built a prison to protect your daughter, but you locked her in with the monster." I threw the photograph at him. It floated through the air, a thin piece of paper against a killing machine. It hit his chest plate and stuck to one of the seams. Van looked down at it. In that moment, narrative inertia collapsed. The status quo, Van protects the spire, became impossible to maintain because the premise, Rhea is safe, was false. The magnitude of this realization was greater than the energy in the reactor. Van's eyes stopped zooming. The green light returned, faint behind the blue. He looked at Ilara, not as a threat, but as his wife. "Ilara?" he whispered. "What have I done?" The speakers in the ceiling crackled to life. It was Morgrave. He no longer sounded calm. He sounded afraid. "Unit 734, ignore the data. It is a virus. Kill them. Kill them now." Van looked up at the ceiling. He looked at his arm, which was still glowing with lethal energy. He didn't lower it. He turned it. He aimed the weapon at the elevator shaft behind him, the artery of the entire building. "Scribe," Van said. A tear of oil and water ran down his gray cheek. "Write this down." "What?" I asked. That the jester didn't laugh at the end. He fired. The beam hit the main elevator cables and the power conduit running parallel to them. It was like severing the spinal cord of a giant. The lights in the lobby died. The force field vanished. The elevator crashed into the basement with a thud that shook the foundation. The spire went dark. The hum was gone. Van fell to his knees. Without the building's power, his suit was just dead weight. He was trapped in his own shell. Ilara crawled to him. Her fungal body was damaged, burnt, but she didn't care. She placed her glowing hands on his metal face. "We are here," she whispered. "We are awake." I turned to the stairs. 100 floors. Moorgrave was up there. And Rhea. I had no weapons left. My journal was empty. But I had narrative momentum. The entire weight of the city was pushing me up those stairs. 42. The Ghost in the Ink. The lobby of the White Spire was a graveyard of good intentions. Van lay slumped against the marble reception desk. The chrome exoskeleton that had kept him upright was dead, heavy and useless without the Spire's power. He looked smaller now. Not a monster, not a legend. Just a man crushed inside a metal cage of his own making. I knelt beside him. "You remember," Van wheezed, his eyes struggling to focus on me without the aid of the targeting lenses. "You remember the bread? On the fire escape?" I hesitated. The memory was vivid in my mind. The taste of stale rye, the smell of rain, his laughter. But looking at his aged face, the gray in his beard that spoke of 20 years of war I hadn't witnessed, I realized the truth. "I remember reading about it," I said softly. "In your journals. Entry 402. You wrote it so well, Van. I felt like I was there." Van smiled weakly. A trickle of blood ran from his nose, mixing with the hydraulic fluid on his lip. "That is the danger of words, scribe. You borrow other men's ghosts until they haunt you." He gripped my wrist. His metal fingers were cold, but his grip was desperate. "I've been fighting him for 20 years, Kalen. Before you, before the Guild. I built the Anarchy to hide her. I built the Glimmer to fund it. I turned Torin into a drug lord because I needed a monster to guard the gate." He coughed, his body seizing in pain. I thought, if I made the world chaotic enough, Moorgrave's order couldn't find us. I was wrong. Chaos is just another pattern he learned to predict. I looked at Alara. She was weaving a cocoon of glowing roots around Van's broken legs, stabilizing him. She wasn't healing him for battle. She was preparing him for rest. "He is upstairs," Van whispered. "Moorgrave. He doesn't have weapons anymore. The silencers run on the broadcast grid. They are statues now. It's just him." "And Rhea?" I asked. "She is the battery," Van said, his voice breaking. "He connected her to the core. If you disconnect her, the shock might stop her heart." He looked at me with an intensity that pierced through me. "You have to be precise, scribe. You can't use force. You have to use syntax. You have to edit the connection without breaking the sentence." I stood up. I understood. This wasn't about blowing up a building. It was about surgery. I looked at the staircase. 100 floors of darkness. A vertical tunnel leading to the man who wanted to turn the human soul into a math problem. "Why me?" I asked, looking back at the broken alchemist and the grieving mother. "You have the power. You have the magic. I just have a pen." Van closed his eyes. "Because magic breaks the laws of physics," he whispered. "But stories? Stories rewrite the laws. Go, Kalen. Go and write the end." I turned to the stairs. I checked my pockets. No knife, no gun. Just the mahogany box with the photo and my journal. I began to climb. Step 1, step 2. My legs burned, my breath hitched. But with every step, the confusion of the past weeks cleared. The hollows eating their silent dinners, the syndicate brewing poison, the lie of the jester. It all fit into the narrative Moorgrave had constructed. He had built a story where freedom equaled pain, and submission equaled peace. My job wasn't to kill him. My job was to prove that his premise was flawed. I climbed past the 10th floor. The silence was absolute. I climbed past the 20th floor. I could hear my own heart, a lonely drum in the dark. I wasn't Kalen the spy anymore. I wasn't Kalen the warrior. I was the scribe. And I was coming to correct the draft. 43. The Long Climb. Floor 50. I stopped to rest. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I looked out of a window. The city below was dark. The hum was gone, and with it, the artificial lights. But it wasn't pitch black. Down in the plaza, I saw a faint, bioluminescent glow. Ilara's forest. It was pulsing, breathing. And further out, in the residential sectors, I saw tiny flickers, candles, oil lamps. The hollows were waking up. Without the signal to dictate their rhythm, they were confused, scared, perhaps crying. But they were lighting fires. They were seeking each other out. The glitch I had started with a single red ribbon was now a citywide reboot. I realized then the power of narrative dynamics. It wasn't a magic spell. It was simply the understanding that people are not machines. If you remove the program, the human resets to its default state. Connection. I forced myself up. Floor 75. My legs were trembling. I was hallucinating slightly from exhaustion. I thought I heard Jinx laughing in the shadows of the landing. I thought I smelled Ria's hair, oranges and grease. Hold on, I whispered to the empty air. Floor 99. The door to the penthouse. The sanctum of the architect. It wasn't a blast door. It was a simple, elegant door of white wood. It looked like the door to a nursery. I stood there for a long time. My hand hovered over the handle. Inside was the man who had turned Torin's brother into a vegetable. The man who had enslaved Van. The man who was currently draining the life out of the woman I loved. I didn't feel anger. Anger is chaotic. Anger is messy. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I opened the journal. I found a blank page. Chapter final, I whispered. The editor arrives. I opened the door. 44. The quietest room in the world. The door to the penthouse wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Fear is a better latch than any deadbolt. I pushed it open. I expected a throne room. I expected screens, data streams, the cold hum of a supercomputer. Instead, I stepped into a library. It was a large, circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the night sky was dark, the city below invisible. Inside, the walls were lined with white bookshelves, but the shelves were empty. No books, no paper, just row after row of pristine white dust. In the center of the room, sitting in a simple wooden chair, was Morgrave. He was older than he looked on the screens. Without the digital filters of the broadcast, his skin was like parchment, thin and translucent. He wore a simple gray sweater. He looked like a retired professor waiting for a train that was running late. He didn't look up when I entered. He was watching the girl. Ria. She wasn't floating in liquid. She was suspended in light. Dozens of thin, optical fibers were attached to her temples, her wrists, her heart. The light pulsed slowly, in time with her breathing. Blue, white, blue, white. It was the only color in the room. "Please," Morgrave said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "Close the door. You are letting the draft in." I closed the door. The latch clicked, a sharp, violent sound in the vacuum. I walked toward him. My boots squeaked on the polished floor. I felt dirty. I felt the mud of the sump, the grease of the refinery, and the blood of the lobby clinging to me. I was a contaminant in a sterile environment. "The power is cut," I said. "Van severed the line." "I know," Morgrave said. He finally looked at me. His silver eyes were dull, the internal mechanisms powered down. I felt the silence return. "It is heavy, isn't it?" He gestured to the empty shelves. "I spent 20 years trying to organize the noise, scribe. Van created the chaos, the drugs, the gas, the riots. He thought chaos was freedom. I knew it was just pain disguised as movement. He pointed a shaking finger at Rhea. She is the answer. Her blood. It doesn't reject the signal. It harmonizes it. With her, I could have created a world without grief. A world where a mother doesn't cry when her child dies because she understands the mathematical necessity of the loss. I looked at Rhea. Her face was peaceful. Too peaceful. It was the peace of a stone at the bottom of a lake. That isn't peace, I said, feeling the narrative vector of his argument pressing against me. It was seductive. Who doesn't want to stop hurting? That is just a pause button. And what do you offer? Morgrave asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded sad. If you wake her, the signal stops. The grief returns. The anger returns. The wars will start again. The hollows downstairs? They are waking up right now. And do you know what the first thing they will do is? He looked me in the eye. They will scream. I looked down at my journal. The leather was stained. The pages were dog-eared. Yes, I admitted. They will scream. And then they will eat. And then they will love. And then they will die. I walked past him toward the glass cylinder. That is the contract, architect. You don't get the joy without the mess. Morgrave didn't try to stop me. He didn't have the magnitude to stop me. His story had run out of inertia. He simply slumped in his chair, a man whose equation had been solved by a variable he refused to acknowledge. I stood before the glass. Rhea looked like she was sleeping. I remembered what Van said. Be precise. Edit the connection. I didn't smash the glass. That would be an act of violence. I reached for the control panel at the base of the cylinder. It was analog, a series of switches and dials. I hesitated. My hand trembled. I was about to reintroduce pain into the world. I was about to break the silence. I looked at Rhea's hand, the one she had cut in the refinery. The bandage was still there, dark with dried blood. Blood, I thought. The ink of the human body. I turned the dial. 45. The first breath. The light in the cylinder faded. The optical fibers detached from her skin with soft, wet pops, retracting into the ceiling like frightened snakes. The glass door hissed open. Rhea didn't fall. She sagged. I caught her before she hit the floor. She was warm, feverishly warm. She smelled of the antiseptic of the spire, but underneath that, faintly, was the smell of the sump. She hung limp in my arms. Rhea, I whispered. For a long moment there was nothing, just the silence of the room and the gaze of the old man watching us from his chair. Then she gasped. It was a terrible sound, a ragged, desperate inhale that racked her entire body. She coughed, clutching my coat, her fingers digging into my shoulders. She opened her eyes. They weren't glowing. They were gray, confused, terrified. "Kaelin?" she rasped. Her voice was raw, unused. "I'm here," I said, holding her tighter. "I'm here." She looked around the white room. She saw the empty shelves. She saw Morgrave. "Is it?" She swallowed, wincing. "Is it over?" "The silence is over," I said. She buried her face in my chest and began to sob. It wasn't a poetic cry. It was ugly, loud, and shaking. It was the sound of 20 years of suppressed trauma breaking the dam. Morgrave watched us. He looked at the crying woman, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his silver eyes. He saw the energy in the room shifting. He saw that the grief wasn't destroying us. It was binding us together. He stood up slowly. He walked to the window. "Listen," he whispered. I listened. Far below, through the thick glass, I heard it. It wasn't the hum. It was a roar. The sound of thousands of people in the streets, shouting, crying, breaking windows, laughing. The city was waking up. The Anarchy had returned. Morgrave placed his hand on the glass. "It is so loud," he murmured. "It is so incredibly loud." He turned to me. He looked frail. "You have the pen now, scribe," he said. "Do not let the ink dry." He sat back down in his chair, closed his eyes, and simply stopped. He didn't die. He just ceased to be the protagonist. He became scenery, a relic of an era that had just ended. I helped Rhea to her feet. She was weak, but she stood. She looked at her father's nemesis, then at me. "Let's go," she said. "I want to see the rain." We walked out of the white room. We didn't look back. We began the long descent, not into the dark this time, but into the noise, into the beautiful, terrifying mess of a world that was finally free to make its own mistakes. Epilogue: The Silence of Cut Strings. The war for Cenote did not end with a shout. It ended with a sigh. Outside the heavy oak door of the tavern, the rain had begun to wash the soot from the cobblestones. The fires Morgrave had lit were dying down, hissing into steam that curled around the spires like tired ghosts. The hollows, those poor, empty vessels that had terrorized our nights, were no longer screaming. Released from the necro-alchemist's will, they simply stood in the streets, staring up at the weeping clouds, silent as statues waiting for a sculptor that would never return. We had won, or so the ink in my journal claimed. I sat at the corner table, the wood scarred by years of spilled ale and knife games. My quill scratched against the parchment, a dry, rhythmic sound that felt too loud in the quiet room. I was trying to write the word victory, but my hand kept cramping. It felt like a lie. Across the room, Rhea slept on a pile of furs near the hearth. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale in the dying firelight. One hand rested protectively over her stomach. In her sleep, she frowned, as if listening to a whisper I couldn't hear. Earlier, when I had changed the bandages on her arm, I thought I smelled it again. That sickly sweet scent of wet earth and vanilla. The mycelium. But surely that was just a phantom memory, a scent trapped in the fabric of my own fear. And then there was Van. He sat by the window, staring out at the dark, ruined silhouette of the spire. He hadn't washed the blood from his coat. He hadn't spoken since we dragged him out of Morgrave's laboratory. The torture had done something to him. It hadn't just broken his bones, it had rearranged the furniture of his mind. "Van?" I asked softly. He didn't turn. He held a glass of water in his hand. He wasn't drinking it. He was tapping the rim with a long, silver needle. Ting, 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 ting. He was listening to the pitch, his head tilted like a bird hearing a worm beneath the soil. "Do you hear it, Kaelin?" he whispered. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding on glass. "Hear what? The rain?" "The gap," Van said. He turned to me then. The firelight caught his face. The scars Morgrave had carved into his cheeks were fresh, angry red lines that pulled the corners of his mouth upward. It looked like a smile, but his eyes were dead calm. They were the yellow of old parchment, swimming with a golden chemical light that hadn't been there before. "Morgrave is gone," I said, trying to reassure him. "The chains are broken. The hollows are free." "Free?" Van let out a short, dry sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was more like a cough that had sharpness to it. "Puppets are never free, scribe. When you cut the strings, they don't dance. They just collapse." He looked back at the glass. He tapped it again. "I saw things in that chair, Kaelin. When the pain stopped being pain and started being color. I saw the wires that hold the world up. They are thin, so very thin." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single playing card. It was charred at the edges. The fool. He placed it on the windowsill, face up. "We didn't win," he murmured, his voice dipping into a register that made the hair on my arm stand up. We just made a mess. And the janitors, they hate messes. Suddenly, the air in the tavern shifted. The flame in the hearth didn't flicker. It leaned sideways as if drawn by a magnet. On the far wall, a dormant screen, a relic of the old world, buzzed. It wasn't a loud alarm. It was a soft, polite chime. The screen washed the room in a cold, clinical white light. Text began to scroll, crisp and terrified in its perfection. Sector 4. Status. Contagion detected. Source. Unlicensed alchemy/necrotic residue. Solution. The Aurora Pact. Protocol. Sanitize. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. What is that? Van didn't look at the screen. He looked at his reflection in the window pane. In the glass, his reflection was smiling, a wide, toothy grin that Van himself wasn't making. That, Van whispered, is the punchline. He picked up the silver needle and drove it into the wood of the windowsill. The alchemist is dead, Kalen. He couldn't take the joke. He turned to me, and for a fleeting second, the shadows around him seemed to warp, painting him in the guise of a jester with a crown of thorns. Let's see if the anarchist has better luck. Outside, the rain stopped, but the thunder didn't. High above the clouds, a deep mechanical humming began, the sound of a massive engine waking up. Rhea stirred in her sleep, clutching her stomach. "Ilara," she whimpered into the furs. I looked at my journal. The ink was still wet on the word victory. I watched as a drop of water from the leaking roof fell onto the page, hitting the word dead center, dissolving it into a shapeless gray smear. I closed the book. End of Book 1.